Every game carries details that were never meant to be noticed, facts that exist simply because something had to be decided, and someone made a quiet choice, and the choice settled into the code like sediment at the bottom of a still lake. The Pokémon series is full of these moments, small decisions, and curious numbers, and overlooked mechanics that shaped every journey without ever announcing themselves. These are not the legendary stories. These are not the dramatic reveals. These are the boring facts, the ones that lived in the background all along. And before we drift any further, consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. The base experience points that a Pokémon awards when defeated are not chosen randomly. Each species has a specific yield written into its data, a number that was determined during development and has remained largely consistent across generations. Caterpie, for example, awards a very small number of experience points when defeated, reflecting its role as an early route encounter meant to ease players into the game rather than accelerate their progress. Weedle awards a similarly modest amount, and these two small creatures became the baseline against which designers calibrated the rest of the experience yield system. The way experience points scale across an evolutionary line follows a pattern that the developers maintained with quiet consistency. A Metapod awards more experience than a Caterpie, and a Butterfree awards more than a Metapod. This progression was not accidental. It was a deliberate design choice meant to reward players for raising creatures through their full lines, ensuring that the effort of evolving felt meaningful even in terms of the numbers generated during battle. Different Pokémon also belong to different experience groups, which determine how quickly they gain levels. The slow group requires a creature to accumulate more total experience to reach level 100 than any other group, while the erratic group uses a formula that changes its rate of growth depending on what level the Pokémon currently occupies. These groups were assigned based on how powerful the designers expected each species to be at full strength, with legendaries and pseudo-legendaries typically placed in the slow group to reflect their exceptional capability. The medium-fast group is the most common experience group in the series, containing a wide variety of species across many different types and roles. A Pokémon in this group reaches level 100 after accumulating exactly 1 million experience points, which made it the mathematical baseline the developers used when calibrating the other groups. The neatness of that number, 1 million precisely, suggests that medium fast was the group designed first, with all other groups built around it as variations that diverged upward or downward from that central point. Experience groups also affect how long a casual playthrough feels. A player who raises a Pokémon in the fast group through normal gameplay will find it reaching higher levels more quickly, which tends to make certain sections of the game easier. Developers used this to subtly guide players toward keeping certain species longer, since fast-growing creatures feel more responsive and rewarding during the period when players are still learning the systems of the game. The height and weight statistics listed in the Pokédex for each Pokémon are canon measurements that the development team assigned during the original design process. Some of these measurements have become famous for being surprising. Wailord is listed as 14.5 meters in length, making it one of the largest Pokémon by volume, yet its weight is listed as 398 kilograms, which means its density is far lower than that of water. A creature that size would be expected to weigh many times that amount, and the discrepancy has generated quiet discussion among fans for years. Gengar presents the opposite puzzle. It is listed at 1.5 meters tall and 40 kilograms, which is a reasonable weight for a creature of that size, until one considers that Gengar is described in various Pokédex entries as being the shadow of a Clefable, or as a creature that steals the warmth from any room it enters. The mundane, almost reasonable measurements assigned to a species, described in such unsettling terms, create a strange contrast that gives Gengar a particular kind of eeriness. Cosmog is listed as weighing 100 grams, making it one of the lightest Pokémon in the entire series, despite its cosmic significance within the lore of the Alola region. The contrast between its narrative importance and its almost weightless physical presence was clearly intentional, giving the designers a way to convey fragility and delicacy through a single number without needing any additional explanation. The Pokédex height measurements use the tip of the tallest feature of the species as the upper limit, which means that a creature with a long horn or tall antenna is measured to that point rather than to the top of its body. This creates some inconsistency in how height is perceived, since two Pokémon listed at the same height might look very different in terms of actual body size if one of them has a disproportionately tall feature. The measurement convention was established early and has been maintained consistently, even when it produces visually surprising results. The Pokémon games have always included a mechanic for tracking how many steps a player has taken on their journey. In the earlier generations, this step counter served a specific and practical function, since certain eggs required a minimum number of steps before they would hatch. The exact number of steps required for each egg was embedded in the egg's data at the moment it was received, and no amount of waiting or time passing would substitute for the actual step count. Egg cycles are the unit used to describe this hatching requirement. Each egg cycle corresponds to a fixed number of steps, and the total number of cycles required varies by species. Magikarp requires relatively few cycles, reflecting the designer's intention that this humble creature be accessible to players who want to raise one from an egg without significant time investment. Chansey, by contrast, requires a large number of cycles, which connects meaningfully to the species' reputation as a rare and special encounter across many points in the series' history. The Flame Body and Magma Armor abilities both have the number of steps required to hatch an egg when a Pokémon with either ability is present in the party. This mechanic was introduced in the third generation as a quality-of-life consideration, giving players a practical reason to include fire-adjacent species in their party during the breeding process. Slugma and Magcargo, which would otherwise see very limited use in competitive or casual play, became regular presences in the parties of players who were actively raising eggs. The Oval Charm, introduced in later generations, further reduces hatching time by increasing the likelihood that an egg will be produced in the first place. The interaction between these various mechanics, egg cycles, step counts, ability bonuses, and item effects created a surprisingly layered system beneath what appeared on the surface to be a simple waiting game. Players who understood the system could hatch eggs with significant efficiency, while those who were unaware simply walked in circles, wondering why their egg was taking so long. The move Splash is perhaps the most studied example of deliberate uselessness in the entire series. It has no effect in battle under normal circumstances. It does not deal damage, it does not raise or lower any stat, does not apply any status condition, and does not interact meaningfully with any mechanic in the game. The message that appears when Splash is used reads simply that nothing happened, which is an unusual level of self-awareness for a game system to display. The move was introduced in the first generation and assigned almost exclusively to Magikarp, connecting it to that species' identity as a helpless creature awaiting transformation. In certain later contexts, Splash has been given marginal utility. A small number of abilities, or held items, can interact with the act of using a move, triggering effects that occur regardless of whether the move itself accomplishes anything. A Pokémon holding a certain item might restore a small amount of HP upon using any move, including Splash, which technically makes the move useful in extremely specific circumstances that were almost certainly never the original intention. The designers have acknowledged that Splash was meant to be useless, and the fact that creative players found narrow applications for it anyway reflects the system's depth. The move Memento causes the user to faint while sharply lowering the target's attack and special attack stats simultaneously. It is a move defined entirely by sacrifice, and it carries a name derived from the Latin word for memory, which gives it a quietly melancholy quality. A Pokémon that uses Memento is gone from the battle immediately, but it leaves a mark on the opposing Pokémon that its teammates can then exploit. The move has seen consistent use in competitive play precisely because the trait it offers, one fainting Pokémon for 2 sharply reduced stats on the opponent, can be enormously valuable at critical moments. The move Baton Pass allows a Pokémon to switch out and pass any stat changes or volatile status conditions it has accumulated to the incoming ally. This creates a mechanic where one Pokémon can spend several turns raising its own stats before passing those boosts to a faster, more offensively capable partner. The resulting combinations became a significant part of competitive play across multiple generations, and Baton Pass strategies were eventually restricted in official competitive formats because the chain of boosts they could create was considered too difficult to counterplay consistently. The Pokédex numbering system began as a purely internal, organizational tool during the development of the first generation. Ken Sugimori and the team at Game Freak assigned numbers to each species as a way of tracking them through the design pipeline, and these internal numbers eventually became the official national dex numbers that players see in the finished games. The numbering does not follow a strict taxonomic or ecological logic, which is why creatures as different as Bulbasaur and Ivysaur share consecutive numbers while unrelated species occupy neighboring slots throughout the list. Bulbasaur occupies the first slot, not because it was the first Pokémon designed, but because the developers made a deliberate decision about which species should open the list. By some accounts, Raiden was the first fully designed Pokémon, and its internal designation in the game's code reflects that early origin. But for the purposes of the national dex, as presented to players, Bulbasaur was chosen as number 1, giving the series a grass and poison type as its opening entry, which is a choice that surprised many players who might have expected something more visually striking or immediately recognizable. The regional Pokédex numbering used within each game is entirely separate from the national numbering system, and the two can diverge significantly. In the Hoenn regional dex, Trico is listed first as the grass-type starter, and the numbering proceeds from there through the creatures encountered across that region. When the national dex feature is unlocked within the same game, a different set of numbers activates for those same species, reflecting their position in the global listing. Players who never unlocked the national dex in certain games only ever saw the regional numbers, and the two systems existed in parallel without ever needing to interfere with each other. New Pokémon are assigned national dex numbers in batches corresponding to their generation of introduction. The numbers 494 through 649 belong to Generation 5 species, regardless of whether those species were available in the original Generation 5 games or introduced later through events. This means the numbering system implicitly encodes generational information, and a player who knows the ranges can determine which generation a species belongs to from its number alone without needing any additional context. The sound design for Pokémon cries in the first generation was created under severe memory constraints. Each cry was stored as a short waveform that took up a small amount of space on the cartridge, and the total number of unique base cries was significantly smaller than the number of Pokémon in the game. The developers addressed this by applying pitch and tempo modifications to base waveforms, creating the impression of distinct cries while actually reusing the same underlying audio data across multiple species. Raiden, Gengar, and Nidoran share a base cry waveform that has been identified by audio researchers who analyzed the game's data. The relationship between these three cries is audible once pointed out, though it tends to disappear back into the background of familiarity once a player has heard each cry enough times to associate it primarily with its species. The human ear is very good at learning to distinguish things that have been heard repeatedly, even when those things share underlying characteristics, and this adaptation effectively masked the recycling for most players throughout their childhoods. Pikachu's cry in the animated series is a voice performance rather than a synthesized waveform, which creates a distinction between the in-game version and the anime version of the character's sound. The actress who provides Pikachu's voice in the Japanese version of the anime has performed the character continuously for decades, creating a vocal identity for the species that has become entirely separate from the electronic approximation used in the games. When Pikachu-themed events or crossovers involve the anime version of the character's cry, players sometimes notice the difference, though for many the two versions have merged into a single, unified concept in memory. The cry for Unknown, the letter-shaped Pokémon introduced in the second generation, is the same for all 28 forms of the species. Each form looks different, corresponding to a different letter of the alphabet, plus an exclamation mark and a question mark, but they all share a single sound. The decision to give every Oon form the same cry was almost certainly a memory conservation choice, since storing 28 distinct cries for a species that appears in a single optional dungeon would have used space that could be allocated to other elements of the game. The friendship mechanic, sometimes called happiness in older games, governs certain aspects of how a Pokémon behaves toward its trainer within the game's systems. Some evolutions are gated behind a friendship threshold, meaning a Pokémon will only evolve when its internal friendship value reaches a certain number. Eevee evolves into Espeon or Umbreon based on friendship combined with the time of day, a combination that creates a quiet symbolism about the relationship between trust and transformation. Friendship values start at a baseline when a Pokémon is first obtained. Wild-caught Pokémon begin with a lower value than those received as gifts or hatched from eggs, which reflects a design philosophy suggesting that a creature raised from the beginning of its life will naturally feel more attached to its trainer. Traded Pokémon reset to the base value upon being received, acknowledging the disruption of being moved from one trainer to another. Certain actions reduce friendship. Allowing a Pokémon to faint in battle lowers its value slightly, as does using certain bitter herbal medicines that restore health at the cost of a small friendship penalty. These mechanics encourage players to care for their team in a way that reflects genuine attentiveness rather than simple item usage. A player who frequently allows their Pokémon to faint or uses bitter medicines regularly will find that certain friendship-dependent evolutions take significantly longer to trigger. The move return has its base power determined by the user's friendship value, scaling up to a maximum of 102 when friendship is at its highest possible value. Return is considered a reliable and generally useful normal-type move precisely because a well-loved Pokémon delivers it at considerable strength. Its counterpart, Move Frustration, scales inversely, becoming stronger when friendship is low. The existence of frustration implies that the game's designers imagined scenarios where players might deliberately neglect their Pokémon and decided to acknowledge that relationship mechanically rather than ignoring it. The internal type chart that governs effectiveness between types has been revised across generations in ways that significantly changed strategic interactions. In the first generation, Ghost-type moves had no effect on Psychic-type Pokémon due to a programming error which was the opposite of the intended relationship. The intended design was that ghost types would be super effective against psychic types, providing a natural counter to what was otherwise an extremely powerful category of species. The error was not corrected until the second generation, which meant that for an entire generation of players, ghost types existed in a strange strategic position where their primary intended role was unavailable. The poison type was originally super effective against bug type Pokémon. This relationship was removed in the second generation when the type chart was revised, shifting poison to neutral effectiveness against bug. The change reflected a reassessment of how the designers wanted bug types to be positioned, since poison being super effective against bugs made it too easy to eliminate what were intended to be early route challenges. Removing that advantage gave bug types slightly better defensive coverage and reduced the overwhelming prevalence of poison-type moves as general-purpose tools in the early game. The steel type was added in the second generation with an unusual number of resistances, absorbing attacks from 11 different types at reduced effectiveness. This made steel types extremely difficult to damage for trainers who didn't carry the right coverage, and certain steel-type Pokémon became nearly impenetrable walls in competitive play. In the sixth generation, 2 of Steel's resistances were removed, specifically its immunity to Ghost and resistance to Dark, in an adjustment that made the type slightly less dominant defensively, while still leaving it with the most resistances of any type in the game. The Fairy type was introduced in the 6th generation as a direct counter to Dragon types, which had become the dominant category in competitive play over the previous several generations. Dragon types had very few weaknesses, and most of them were resistant to a wide variety of attacks, making them difficult to eliminate and easy to use offensively. Fairy type moves hit dragons for super effective damage, and Fairy types resisted Dragon type moves entirely, which immediately changed how competitive teams were constructed. Gardevoir and Marill, species that had existed since earlier generations, received retroactive Fairy typing, which altered their coverage and their role in play without requiring them to be redesigned. The hidden power move calculates its type and power based on the individual values of the Pokémon using it. Individual values, often called IVs, are a set of hidden statistics that exist for each Pokémon and influence its maximum potential in each of its base stats. Every Pokémon has a value between 0 and 31 in each stat, assigned at the moment it is generated by the game. Hidden power determines its type from a formula that considers the lowest bit of each individual value, which means that a Pokémon's entire stat configuration influences what type hidden power becomes when that Pokémon uses it. The mechanics of hidden power were refined over multiple generations. In its original implementation, the power of the move also varied based on IVs, with a range that could be as low as 30 or as high as 70. In the 6th generation, the damage output was standardized to 60 for all Pokémon, simplifying the calculations players needed to do when evaluating whether to keep or train a specific Pokémon for competitive purposes. The type variance was retained, so hidden power could still be fire, grass, water, or any type except normal and fairy depending on the Pokémon's individual values. Determining what type hidden power would be for a specific Pokémon required using an external formula or consulting a reference chart, since the in-game information available to players did not directly display this calculation. Players in earlier generations would find a specific NPC in certain games who could tell them what type their Pokémon's hidden power was, which was the only in-game method of accessing this information without performing the math manually. The existence of this NPCs as the sole convenient source of this information made them quietly one of the most practically useful characters in the game for serious players. The locations where certain Pokémon can be found in the wild have always been connected to the ecological logic of their designs in ways that reward paying attention. Magnemite and Magneton appear near areas with industrial or electrical infrastructure, which connects to their identity as electromagnetic creatures drawn to power sources. Slowpoke tend to appear near water, despite being classified as a psychic and water type with a notoriously sluggish disposition, which reinforces the idea that their chosen habitat matches their temperament perfectly. The encounter rate for different species within the same location was carefully designed to create a gradient of rarity. Common species appear frequently, filling the majority of wild encounters, while rarer species occupy a smaller percentage of the table and require either patience or luck to find. This system creates a natural sense of discovery and mild surprise, even in areas the player has visited many times, since the possibility of a rare encounter in a common area is never entirely eliminated. Headbutt in the second generation allowed players to shake trees in certain locations to trigger encounters with Pokémon that lived in the canopy. The species available through headbutting varied by location and even by specific tree, meaning that the distribution of Pokémon in Johto was far more granular than a simple area-based system would suggest. Some trees in specific locations had access to Heracross, which was not available through any other encounter method in the game, making tree checking a routine activity for players who wanted a complete collection. Surfing encounters in water routes often include species that cannot be found through any other means in that game. Tentacool appears in almost every ocean route across the series, making it one of the most consistently available water types in any generation, to the point where its ubiquitous presence in surfing encounters became something of a running observation among players. The developers were clearly aware of this reputation by the time the franchise had been running for several generations, which is reflected in various indirect acknowledgments scattered through later entries in the series. The internal variable that tracks how many steps a player has taken without an encounter in tall grass decreases by 1 with each step, and when it reaches 0, a random encounter is triggered. This means that the density of encounters is not truly random, but is instead controlled by a hidden countdown that resets after each encounter or certain other events. Players who understood this variable could attempt to manipulate it using items like repels or cleanse tag, which prevent encounters when the leading Pokémon is at a higher level than the wild Pokémon in the area, effectively extending the time between encounters without the countdown ever reaching 0. The Sweet Scent move has the effect of immediately resetting this counter to 0 and triggering a wild encounter, which made it a useful tool for players who wanted to encounter wild Pokémon quickly rather than wandering through grass, hoping for an encounter to occur naturally. The move's practical utility in this context was entirely separate from its in-battle application, which applies the attract status to the target. Players who kept a Pokémon with Sweet Scent in their party, primarily for the wild encounter shortcut, were using the move for a purpose that existed entirely outside its technical classification. The ability No Guard causes all moves, used by or against the Pokémon, with that ability to have perfect accuracy, which means a Pokémon with No Guard will always hit with its moves, regardless of their accuracy stat, and will always be hit by opposing moves, regardless of its evasiveness. This ability has a meaningful interaction with moves that have very low base accuracy but high power, since a normally unreliable move becomes entirely dependable when No Guard removes the accuracy check. Machamp, which can have No Guard in most generations, becomes significantly more threatening in certain contexts precisely because this ability eliminates the unreliability of otherwise powerful but inaccurate options. The damage formula used to calculate how much a move reduces the target's hit points involves the attacking Pokémon's relevant attack stat, the defending Pokémon's relevant defense stat, the base power of the move, and the user's level, combined through a specific mathematical expression that has remained structurally consistent across generations while receiving small adjustments to certain constants. The formula produces a range of possible damage values rather than a single fixed number, which creates slight variance in actual damage dealt from turn to turn, even when no other variables have changed. This variance is the reason players, in competitive contexts, talk about damage rolls, referring to the range of outcomes that a specific move can produce. Critical hits bypass the stage modifiers applied to the attacker's offensive stat and the defender's defensive stat, which means they deal more damage not only because of the multiplier they apply, but also because they ignore the defensive enhancements the target has accumulated. A Pokémon that has spent several turns raising its defense might still receive significant damage from a critical hit because the critical hit calculation simply discards those accumulated stages. This creates a perpetual element of unpredictability in battle that cannot be eliminated even with careful setup. In the first generation, the critical hit rate was determined by the user's speed stat divided by 512, which meant that the probability varied significantly between species. Jolteon, with its high-speed stat, had a noticeably higher critical hit rate than Slowbro, whose low speed meant that critical hits were quite rare when using it. This speed-based system was replaced in the second generation with a flat-rate system where critical hits had approximately a 1 in 16 chance of occurring regardless of which species was using the move, with certain moves and abilities modifying this base rate. The sleep status condition prevents a Pokémon from taking any action during the turns it is asleep, except through specific mechanics like sleep talk or snore. The number of turns a Pokémon remains asleep is determined at the moment sleep is inflicted and ranges across a window of possible values, with the actual duration invisible to the player. This creates situations where a Pokémon might wake up immediately or might remain asleep for several turns, and the player has no reliable way to know which outcome will occur until it happens. Rest is a move that deliberately inflicts the sleep status on the user as a trade for fully restoring its hit points and curing any existing status condition. A Pokémon that uses rest gives up its ability to act for 2 turns in exchange for returning to full health, which creates a significant but calculable risk. The move has been a part of the series since the first generation and has been used in competitive play across all subsequent generations, particularly on defensive species that have high enough bulk to survive the 2 turns of vulnerability that rest creates. Early sleep mechanics allowed a Pokémon to sleep indefinitely while still being capable of using moves through the sleep talk mechanic, creating situations in competitive play where a sleeping Pokémon was effectively acting every turn through an intermediary. This interaction was considered sufficiently problematic that later generations imposed restrictions on what moves sleep talk could select, or modified how rest interacted with the mechanic, depending on the generation in question. The gradual refinement of sleep mechanics across generations reflects the developer's ongoing attention to how individual mechanics interact when combined with each other and with items and abilities. The held item mechanic was introduced in the second generation as an expansion of the systems available to players in battle and exploration. Prior to held items, Pokémon existed in a relatively flat, strategic space where species, moves, and levels were the primary variables. The ability to give each Pokémon a single held item added an entire dimension to team building, since an item could meaningfully change how a species functioned within the overall structure of the team. A leftovers item, which restores a small fraction of hit points each turn, could transform a borderline defensive Pokémon into a reliable wall by providing passive restoration that extended its longevity. The choice band item locks the user into the first move it selects each time it enters battle, but multiplies the power of physical moves by 1.5. This trade creates a specific type of Pokémon, fast physical attackers, that benefit enormously from the power boost and can threaten to eliminate opponents in a single hit. The counterpart Choice Specs item performs the same function for special moves, and the Choice Scarf item multiplies speed by 1.5 while imposing the same single move restriction. All three choice items see consistent use in competitive play because the power boosts they provide are substantial enough to overcome the limitation they impose in the right circumstances. The Eviolite item multiplies both defense and special defense by 1.5 for Pokémon that are not yet in their final evolutionary form. This item was introduced in the 5th generation and immediately expanded the viability of many species that had previously been set aside in favor of their fully evolved counterparts. Chansey, which evolves into Blissey, became significantly more defensively capable than Blissey itself when holding Eviolite, because Chansey's already enormous hit point total, combined with boosted defenses, created a profile that Blissey could not replicate. The existence of Eviolite changed the calculus around when to evolve a Pokémon, since in some cases evolution actively reduced competitive viability. The move Endeavor reduces the target's hit points to equal the user's remaining hit points. This means a Pokémon that is nearly fainted can use Endeavor to reduce a full health opponent to a similarly low amount, creating a dramatic shift in the battle's state in a single turn. The move has almost no application when the user is at full health, since it would in that case simply fail to do any meaningful damage. It is entirely defined by the vulnerability of the user, which makes it a move that grows stronger as the Pokémon using it approaches elimination. A strategy that became well known among players combined Endeavor with the moves Flail or Reversal, which deal damage proportional to how low the user's remaining hit points are relative to its maximum, and with a Focus Sash, which prevents the holder from being eliminated by a single hit from full health. A Pokémon holding a Focus Sash would survive any one-hit attack that would otherwise have eliminated it, then use Endeavor to reduce the opponent's health to 1, and then use Flail or Reversal at maximum power. This combination was simple enough for younger players to execute and potent enough to succeed against unprepared opponents, and it became a quiet legend among players who discovered it independently before its widespread documentation online. The move Destiny Bond causes the user to faint, along with whichever opposing Pokémon eliminates it during that same turn. It can only activate if the user moves before the opponent, since the move must already be in effect when the finishing blow is delivered. Destiny Bond has a reduced success rate if used consecutively, a limitation added to prevent it from being used as a reliable final resort that's every time the user was threatened. The move reflects a particular dramatic sensibility, the idea that a Pokémon on the edge of elimination can choose to take its attacker with it, which gives the mechanic a finality that is unusual among the game's options. The numerical total of base stats, sometimes referred to as a Pokémon's base stat total, is a number that aggregates its individual stat allocations into a single figure for easy comparison. Legendary Pokémon and pseudo-legendary Pokémon typically have the highest base stat totals in the game, which reflects their exceptional capabilities within the lore of the series. A base stat total of 600 is commonly associated with pseudo-legendary species, which are non-legendary Pokémon that nonetheless occupy a position of unusual power compared to most species encountered in normal gameplay. The distribution of a base stat total across the individual stats matters enormously for how a Pokémon functions in practice. A species with a high base stat total concentrated in hit points and defenses plays very differently from one with the same total concentrated in speed and offensive stats. Blissey has one of the highest hit point totals of any species in the game, but very low physical defense, which makes it an extraordinary special defensive presence, but extremely vulnerable to physical attacks. Shuckle has exceptionally high defensive stats and the lowest hit points and offensive stats of any species, creating a creature that can absorb enormous amounts of damage while being incapable of inflicting meaningful harm without very specific strategies. Shedinja is a species with a unique mechanic that completely overrides the normal significance of its stats. It possesses only one hit point, regardless of level, investment, or any external modifier, but it has an ability called Wonder Guard that prevents any move from dealing damage unless that move is super effective against its typing of Ghost and Bug. In practice, Shedinja can only be damaged by 5 specific types, and a team with proper coverage can remove it immediately. Against a team that lacks those types, however, Shedinja becomes entirely immune to all damage, which creates a highly polarized result, depending entirely on the opponent's composition. The Pokémon trading card game, which exists alongside the video games as a separate but related product, uses a different set of statistics from the video game. Card HP values are calibrated to a different scale, and the concept of types and weaknesses operates somewhat differently between the two systems. A fire-type weakness on a card means that fire attacks deal double the stated damage, but the specifics of the weakness interaction have been modified several times over the course of the card game's history, with multipliers being reduced from double to plus 30 or plus 20 in adjustments that changed how powerful fire-type cards were against grass-type cards. The card game's earliest sets were created while the video game was still in its first generation, which means that certain design decisions made in the card game reflected the game's state at that time. The Psychic type in the card game covers both Psychic type and Ghost type Pokémon from the video game, since the first generation's type chart did not make Ghost types particularly distinct from Psychic types in practice. This bundling of 2 distinct video game types into a single card game type persists in some form, even in later sets, reflecting how foundational the early design decisions were to the card game's structure. Trainer cards, which represent characters, items, and effects rather than Pokémon, have been part of the card game since its beginning. The mechanic of supporter cards, which are a subcategory of trainer cards with a limitation on how many can be played per turn, was introduced as the card game grew in complexity and certain effects became too powerful when used without restriction. The shift of certain effects from unrestricted trainers to once per turn supporters represents the same kind of balance refinement that the video game undergoes through successive generations. The Pokémon animated series initially aired in Japan in April of 1997, preceding the release of the video games in North America by over a year. By the time North American players received the games, they had already been introduced to the animated version of the world through the television broadcast, which means that for many players outside Japan, the anime and the games arrived as a package experience rather than a sequential one. This simultaneous exposure to both media shaped how players formed their initial impressions of species like Pikachu, whose animated personality influenced how players perceived the game character. The episode involving certain flashing animation sequences aired in December of 1997 in Japan and caused photosensitive reactions in a significant number of viewers. The episode was permanently withdrawn from circulation, has never been rebroadcast in Japan, and was not included in the international release of the series. The incident led to changes in how animation was produced for broadcast in Japan generally, with regulations around the use of certain flashing effects being tightened for the industry as a whole. Within the Pokémon animated series specifically, the approach to certain visual effects was modified going forward. The Pokémon anime uses a storytelling convention where the main character's journey is structured around a series of gym battles and competitions that parallel the structure of the video games without perfectly mapping onto any specific game's sequence of events. This approach allows the anime to draw on the games for settings, characters, and Pokémon while maintaining a continuous narrative that does not reset with each new game release. The result is a series that has maintained continuity in its core character dynamics for decades, with the Pokémon world expanding alongside the game series while the central relationships remain recognizable. The Pokémon pinball spin-off games use a physical table metaphor where the player controls a ball represented as a Pokémon in a Pokéball, bouncing it across a table to catch wild Pokémon. The mechanics of pinball, including bumpers, flippers, and multi-ball modes, are mapped onto Pokémon-themed events that trigger at various points during play. Catching a Pokémon in these games requires hitting specific targets a certain number of times while the wild Pokémon is on the table, which translates the video game's catching mechanic into a physical skill challenge rather than a turn-based probability calculation. The Pokémon Snap game for the Nintendo 64 placed players in a rail-mounted vehicle moving through environments inhabited by wild Pokémon, with the objective of taking photographs rather than catching or battling. The quality of each photograph was scored based on factors including the size of the Pokémon in the frame, whether it was centered, whether it was facing the camera, and whether anything unusual was happening in the image. This scoring system required players to interact with the environment to trigger behaviors before photographing them, since a rare or unusual pose scored higher than a standard photograph of the same species. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games restructure the series into a dungeon-crawling format where the player character is themselves a Pokémon rather than a human trainer. The core relationship in these games is between the player character and their partner Pokémon, and the narrative typically involves exploring procedurally arranged dungeons to complete rescue missions. The turn-based movement system means that every step the player takes causes other Pokémon in the dungeon to also take one action, creating a pacing rhythm that differs substantially from the main series while retaining the fundamental relationship between Pokémon species and their characteristics. The number of Pokémon in the national dex has grown with each generation, adding species that represent new types, new regions, and new design directions. The first generation established 151 species, with Mew as a secretive last entry that was encoded into the game but not officially revealed until after the game's release. Subsequent generations have added numbers ranging from just under 100 to several hundred at a time, with the pace of expansion reflecting both the creative ambitions of each generation's development team and the practical constraints of development timelines. Each new generation introduces starter Pokémon across 3 types, typically grass, fire, and water, following a pattern established in the first generation. The starter selection has always been one of the most discussed moments in each new game, since it is the first meaningful choice the player makes, and the selected species will typically accompany them through the entire main story. The designs of starter Pokémon tend to reference broadly recognizable animal archetypes, which makes them immediately legible to new players, while allowing experienced players to speculate about their designs and evolutionary paths before the games are released. Mythical Pokémon are a subset of legendary Pokémon, distinguished by the fact that they are obtained through special distribution events rather than through normal gameplay. In the original games, Mew could not be obtained through any method accessible to the average player, since it was embedded in the game's code but not connected to any in-game location or event that players could discover on their own. The existence of Mew became a playground legend before official acknowledgement, with players sharing stories of methods to find it that were almost entirely fabricated, but that spread organically through the community. The music of the Pokémon series was composed initially by Junichi Masuda, who also contributed to game design and programming in the early years of the franchise. The constraint of the Game Boy's audio capabilities meant that the music had to be written for a small number of simultaneous channels with a limited palette of waveforms. Within those constraints, Masuda created melodies that have proven remarkably durable, with themes from the original games being directly recognizable decades later and referenced in remakes, arrangements, and official concert performances. The Lavender Town music from the first generation has been the subject of more discussion than perhaps any other piece of music in the series. Its unsettling tonal quality created a lasting impression, and the contrast between the soft, childlike aesthetic of most other areas in the game and the Lavender Town theme generated a strong emotional response in players who encountered it for the first time. The music was modified between the Japanese and international releases, with certain frequencies adjusted, which led to various stories about the reason for the change circulating among players over the years. Battle themes in the series follow a structural pattern where the intensity increases at certain transitions during the battle. Wild encounter themes, trainer battle themes, and legendary encounter themes each have distinct characteristics that signal to the player what kind of encounter they are in. The Gym Leader battle theme from the first generation, which has been rearranged in remakes and various spin-offs, established a model for how battle music could communicate stakes through rhythmic urgency and melodic tension that has influenced how subsequent battle themes in the series were written. The weather mechanics introduced in the third generation added a layer to battle that had not been present in earlier generations. Sunlight, rain, hail, and sandstorm each affect battles in specific ways, altering the power of moves, damaging certain types of Pokémon each turn, or providing benefits to Pokémon with specific abilities or typings. Drought, a weather-inducing ability held by Groudon's signature form, sets permanent sunlight, while Drizzle, held by Kyogre's signature form, sets permanent rain. In the fifth generation, these permanent weather effects were linked to the legendary Pokémon that possessed them, and the interaction between permanent weather and weather-dependent strategies dominated competitive play during that period. Sandstream sets permanent sandstorm weather and is an ability associated with Tyranitar and later Hippowdon. Sandstorm deals damage each turn to all Pokémon, except those with rock, ground, or steel typing, or those with certain abilities that grant immunity to the weather's residual damage. Rock-type Pokémon receive a 1.5 multiplier to their special defense stat during Sandstorm, which significantly changes the defensive profile of species like Tyranitar during weather they themselves control. This double benefit, automatic weather, and a defensive bonus, made sand-based teams a common choice in competitive play throughout the generations where permanent weather was available. In the sixth generation, the duration of weather effects set by abilities was reduced from indefinite to 5 turns, or 8 turns, with a held item designed to extend the effect. This change was an explicit balance adjustment targeting the dominance of permanent weather teams in competitive play, and it significantly altered which strategies were viable. Teams that had been built around the assumption of indefinite weather conditions needed to be reconstructed with the understanding that weather would be a temporary resource rather than a constant environmental factor. The berry mechanic introduced alongside held items allows Pokémon to carry a single-use consumable that triggers under certain conditions without requiring any input from the player. Citrus Berry restores hit points when the holder drops below a certain threshold. Lum Berry cures any status condition the moment it is inflicted. Oran Berry restores 10 hit points at a lower threshold than Citrus. Each berry has a specific trigger condition and effect, and selecting the right berry for a specific Pokemon's role requires understanding both the berry's mechanics and the situations that Pokemon is likely to face in battle. In the second generation, berries could be grown on specific plots of land in the overworld, creating a farming mechanic that rewarded players who tended their plots regularly. The growth cycle operated in real time, meaning that a berry planted before sleep might be ready to harvest upon waking, which created a gentle daily rhythm to the activity of maintaining a berry supply. This real-time farming system was not retained in all subsequent generations, with some games replacing it with simplified systems that did not require the same investment of actual time. Apricorns are a related item category that cannot be used directly but can be converted by specific characters into custom Pokeballs with unique properties. Friend Ball, which raises the initial friendship of a Pokemon caught with it. Heavy Ball, which performs better against Pokemon with high weight. And Lure Ball, which has improved capture rates against Pokemon found through surfing, are among the custom balls available through this conversion. The Apricorn system was introduced in the second generation and has appeared in certain later games as a callback to that era, appealing to players who remember gathering the colorful fruits from specific trees on routes throughout Johto. The Pokemon Daycare, which appears in most games in the series, accepts Pokemon and levels them up passively while the player explores. In earlier generations, the Daycare would also forget moves as the Pokemon leveled up, replacing them with newly learned moves from the level up move pool without input from the player. This meant a player who left a Pokemon in the Daycare for a long time could return to find that it had replaced carefully chosen moves with newly learned ones, creating a quiet frustration for players who did not account for this behavior when choosing what to leave. Leaving two compatible Pokemon together in the Daycare could result in the production of an egg discovered by speaking to the daycare worker outside the facility. The compatibility between two Pokemon for egg production depends on their egg groups, which are internal categories that group species by the type of creature they are capable of breeding with. Each species belongs to one or two egg groups, and two Pokemon can produce an egg only if they share at least one. The resulting egg hatches into a Pokemon of the mother species, or the lower evolutionary form of the mother species, which allows players to produce multiple copies of the same species or to breed for specific moves that the mother or father knows. The Ditto species occupies its own unique position in the breeding system because it can breed with almost any Pokemon, regardless of egg group. A Ditto pairs with virtually any species capable of producing eggs and substitutes for the missing member of a compatible pair, which makes it an extremely practical species for players who want to breed specific Pokemon and don't want to maintain pairs of each species. Ditto with desirable individual values became a sought-after commodity among players who engaged seriously with the breeding and competitive systems, and obtaining a Ditto from a different language game provided specific advantages related to how probability calculations are handled when the two breeding Pokemon have different language origins. The Elite Four and Champion structure that anchors the endgame of most main series Pokemon games was preceded in development by alternative ideas about how to create a final challenge. The decision to use 4 specialists, followed by a single champion, provided a natural escalation of difficulty, while also giving each individual confrontation a distinct thematic identity defined by the Elite Four members' chosen type or style. The champion, by design, typically uses a more varied team than the specialists, reflecting a different kind of mastery. In the first generation, the rival appears as the champion at the conclusion of the Elite Four Gauntlet, which creates a narrative surprise for players who were not expecting their most persistent opponent to occupy that position. The rival's team at that point in the game is tailored to include the starter Pokémon that is strong against the player's chosen starter, which completes the thematic opposition that was established at the beginning of the game when the rival chose his starter. The encounter in the Champion Chamber is one of the few times in the first generation where the narrative and the gameplay mechanics directly reinforce each other in a way that players are likely to notice consciously. Cynthia, the champion of the Sinnoh region, is frequently cited as the most challenging champion in the series. Her team includes Spiritomb, which had no weaknesses in the generation it was introduced in, and Garchomp, which had outstanding offensive and speed stats. The combination of a team without easy type-based entry points and individual Pokémon with competitive level capabilities created a champion battle that required genuine preparation rather than the reliance on overleveling or type advantages that could carry players through other champion encounters. Cynthia's difficulty relative to other champions has become a consistent point of reference in discussions about progression balance in the series. The contests introduced in the third generation added a non-combat performance element to the game that evaluated Pokémon based on categories like coolness, beauty, cuteness, cleverness, and toughness. Pokémon were evaluated on their condition in these categories, which was improved by feeding them Pokéblocks made from berries. The contest itself then had a performance phase where the Pokémon performed moves, each of which had a contest appeal value in addition to its battle properties. A move's contest appeal value was entirely separate from its competitive utility, which created the interesting situation where moves that were rarely used in battle might have exceptional contest appeal. A move that had low damage and inconsistent accuracy might appeal strongly to judges in the clever category, giving it a purpose in the game that it could not find in the battle system. This created a reason to consider a much wider range of moves when building a team intended for contests rather than battle, and players who engaged with both systems had to maintain something like 2 separate frameworks for evaluating their options. Super contests in the 4th generation expanded the system with a more elaborate rhythm-based performance phase, where players timed button presses to music. The visual presentation of super contests was more elaborate than the 3rd generation version, with more pronounced animation and more feedback to the player about how their performance was being received. The contest system represents one of the more sustained attempts the series has made to provide a meaningful, non-combat activity alongside the main battle-focused progression, and it maintained a dedicated following among players who preferred its aesthetic challenges to the strategic demands of the main game. The move sketch, exclusively learned by Smeargle, allows that species to permanently copy the last move used by the opponent. After using Sketch, Smeargle permanently replaces Sketch in that move slot with whatever move it copied, and it can then use that move in future battles, exactly as though the move were its own. Because Smeargle can learn Sketch multiple times as it levels up, it is theoretically capable of learning any move in the game that can be used in battle, making it the only species with a completely open move pool. The practical applications of Smeargle's ability to copy moves have been explored across competitive generations, with different combinations of moves being identified as particularly powerful on a Pokémon that otherwise has very low stats. Smeargle's actual offensive and defensive capabilities are minimal, which means it tends to function in competitive play as a support lead whose value comes entirely from its move access rather than its base statistics. Moves that provide setup, entry hazards, or particular combinations of effects can be assembled on Smeargle in ways that no other species can replicate. The move Mimic, which predates Sketch in the 1st generation, temporarily copies a move the opponent used and allows the user to employ that copied move for the remainder of the battle. Unlike Sketch, Mimic does not make the copy permanent, and the temporary nature of its effect means it does not fundamentally alter the using Pokémon's capabilities in the same way. The distinction between mimic and sketch was never clearly explained to players in the games themselves, and many players who encountered mimic in the first generation were unaware that a permanent copying move would later be introduced for a specific species. The Pokémon games have always included a small number of events or encounters that are explicitly described as occurring only once per playthrough. The legendary Pokémon encounters at specific locations are the most famous examples, but the once-per-game limitation applies to many other elements as well. Certain items can only be found once, certain characters only appear for a single interaction, and certain opportunities to make choices that affect the game's progression only present themselves once before closing permanently. The one-time nature of legendary encounters creates a specific kind of pressure for players who want to capture rather than defeat the legendary they encounter. If the legendary faints, it typically disappears and cannot be encountered again in that save file, which means the player must either have saved before the encounter or accept that the legendary is lost for that playthrough. The development of soft resetting, where a player saves before an encounter and reloads the save if the encounter goes poorly, is a direct response to this one-time structure, and it has become a standard technique among players who care about legendary collection or who are seeking specific attributes like shininess. The Master Ball is designed to solve the pressure of legendary encounters by guaranteeing capture regardless of the Pokémon's health or the capture rate of the species. Each playthrough provides a single Master Ball through the main story, and the decision of which Pokémon to use it on is one that many players deliberate carefully. Using a Master Ball on a legendary with a particularly low capture rate or a particularly high tendency to escape saves the player an enormous amount of time and frustration, while saving it for no particular reason means that time and frustration are never avoided, but the Master Ball is also never spent. Some players retain their Master Ball throughout the entire game without using it, deriving a particular satisfaction from knowing it is available even if it never becomes necessary. The storage system for Pokémon that are not in the active party has existed in the games since the very beginning, though its visual representation and capacity have changed substantially. In the first generation, the PC box system was presented as a text-based interface where Pokémon were stored in boxes labeled by number, and the player had to manually switch between boxes to access different groups of stored Pokémon. The number of boxes available limited how many Pokémon a player could store in total, and managing the available space was an actual constraint for players who caught everything they encountered. Bill, who is the character credited with developing the PC storage system in the Kanto region, appears in the games as an eccentric researcher who has become accidentally merged with a Pokémon due to a teleportation experiment gone wrong. The player resolves the situation before Bill rewards them with a ticket to an event that advances the story. The connection between Bill and the PC storage system is established through this interaction, providing a small piece of in-world explanation for why the technology exists and who is responsible for maintaining it. In later generations, the storage system received a visual overhaul that allowed players to see small images of the Pokémon stored in each slot, which made navigation substantially more intuitive. The capacity of the storage system also expanded significantly across generations, reflecting both the growing number of available species and the increased tendency for players to engage with the catching and collection aspects of the game more thoroughly than earlier players had. The visual and functional improvements to the storage system are among the most practically meaningful quality of life changes across the series' history, since every player who catches more than 6 Pokémon interacts with the storage system as a fundamental part of the experience. The Pokémon world maintains a fiction of ecological coherence that the games support through careful distribution of species across environments. Fire types tend to appear in volcanic areas, arid roads, or locations with an established association with heat. Water types populate coastal routes, rivers, and ocean areas. Grass types appear in forests and meadows. These distributional patterns create a sense that the world operates according to consistent ecological principles, even though it is obviously a constructed fantasy setting. Professor Oak, the primary authority figure in the Kanto games, provides the player character with their starter Pokémon and establishes the initial motivation for Pokédex completion. Professors in subsequent generations have followed the same structural role, each named after a different tree and each establishing the tone and direction of their respective region's main narrative. Professor Elm in Johto is more research-focused and less adventurous than Oak, while Professor Birch in Hoenn is caught in the field, being chased by a wild Pokémon when the player first encounters him, establishing a different kind of academic character. The Pokémon Professor role is explicitly presented as the entry point into the wider world of Pokémon training, providing equipment, information, and motivation before the player departs on their journey. The recurrence of this structure across every main series entry creates a familiar starting rhythm that allows new players to orient themselves quickly while providing returning players with a known sequence of events that confirms they are beginning a new adventure. The consistency of this opening structure is one of the most reliable elements of the series, maintained even as other aspects of game design have evolved substantially. The concept of Nuzlocke challenges emerged from the fan community as an unofficial additional layer of rules overlaid on the standard game experience. The core rules of a Nuzlocke restrict which Pokémon can be caught, typically limiting the player to the first Pokémon encountered in each area, and declare that any Pokémon that faints is permanently eliminated from use for the rest of that run. These two rules transform the game into a significantly higher stakes experience, where individual encounters carry meaningful consequences rather than being minor obstacles on the way to the next story beat. The Nuzlocke format spread through online communities because it extended the longevity of games that players had already completed, providing a new way to engage with familiar content. Players who had finished the main story multiple times found that the Nuzlocke framework recontextualized every encounter as a potential threat, creating genuine tension in moments that had long since become routine. The format also inspired players to use species they would typically overlook, since the restriction on which Pokémon could be caught meant that the team composition was partly determined by luck rather than entirely by preference. Subsequent variations on the Nuzlocke format have been created by the community, adding additional rules that increase or modify the challenge. Some variations add a rule that Pokémon must be nicknamed to encourage attachment. Others add type restrictions, blackout conditions, or additional limitations on item usage. The willingness of the community to continue inventing new ways to engage with the games reflects how durable the core experience is as a foundation for a wide variety of challenge structures, and how much room there is for the standard rule to be expanded without breaking the fundamental enjoyment of the game. There are areas in the Pokémon games where the developers left details that were never intended to be visible to players, but became accessible through exploration or oversight. The space directly above Viridian City in the first generation is accessible through a sequence of actions that involve a specific NPC in a particular state, and walking into this space allows the player to encounter wild Pokémon from a location that was not intended to be accessible. The encounter table for this area includes species not normally available in Kanto, since the table in that space was not populated for normal gameplay and draws from default data. The truck near the SS Ane in the first generation is a famous example of an environment detail that exists in the game but has no programmatic function. The truck can be seen from certain angles on the dock and has been the subject of speculations about hidden items or encounters hidden beneath it, since the presence of such a specific and unusual object seemed to imply significance. The truck is simply a visual detail that was placed without any associated interactive content, and the speculations about it reflect how thoroughly players scrutinize their environments when they believe that secrets might be hidden anywhere. The Entralink in the 5th generation was a special area accessible through a communication feature that allowed players in different games to interact in limited ways within a shared space. The functionality required specific wireless conditions and was most easily used when players were in physical proximity, which meant that for players without access to other players nearby, the Entralink existed as an accessible but essentially empty space that hinted at multiplayer experiences they were not able to access. The area and its associated features were never particularly prominent in the core experience of those games, but they represented an ambition toward connected play that informed later developments in the series. The wishing well and coin mechanics in the Pokémon series have appeared in various forms across different games and spin-offs, reflecting the broader design interest in randomized reward systems that complement the deterministic structure of the main game. The Game Corner, which appeared in several early games and featured slot machines where coins could be won and exchanged for prizes including Pokémon, was eventually removed from some regional versions of the games and from later entries due to concerns about gambling mechanics in games marketed to children. The prizes that had been available through the Game Corner were made available through alternative methods in versions and games that did not include the facility. The fortune-telling characters that appear in various games across the series provide hints about items, encounters, or future events, though their predictions are often expressed in language, ambiguous enough to be interpreted multiple ways. These characters follow a tradition of fortune-telling figures in Japanese media and games, adding a layer of mysticism to the gameplay experience without requiring any mechanical commitment to the predictions they offer. Players who remember receiving a hint that proved accurate tended to return to these characters in future playthroughs, while those whose predicted hints turned out to be less directly useful were more likely to dismiss them as flavor without consequence. The lottery that appears in various Pokémon centers across different games draws numbers each day and compares them to the identification numbers of the Pokémon in the player's current party and storage. Matching progressively more digits of the identification number results in progressively better prizes, with a full match of all 5 digits resulting in the best available reward. The probability of a complete match is low enough that many players go through entire playthroughs without winning the top prize, but having more Pokémon from more different sources in storage increases the number of ID numbers being compared against the daily draw, improving the statistical likelihood of some match occurring. The design of each Pokémon's model has become progressively more detailed as the hardware running the games has become capable of rendering more complexity. The transition from 2-dimensional sprites to 3-dimensional models occurred in the 6th generation for the main series, representing a shift that had been anticipated by players for years, given how long the hardware had been capable of rendering 3-dimensional graphics at appropriate quality. The move to 3-dimensional models meant that each species had to be modeled, so rigged and animated from scratch for that generation, while subsequent generations were able to reuse and update those models rather than rebuilding from the beginning. Sprite artists who worked on the 2-dimensional pixel representations of earlier games developed techniques for conveying personality and motion within the severe constraints of the format. Back sprites, which appeared during battle when the player's Pokémon was active, were typically less detailed than front sprites because the player spent more time looking at them, and smaller differences were less noticeable at the scale of ongoing attention. Front sprites were visible only when the player attacked an opposing Pokémon and when looking at the Pokédex, which meant they were seen in moments of focused attention rather than extended viewing. The animated sprite feature introduced in later games of the two-dimensional era added small looping animations to the otherwise static images, giving Pokémon a sense of life during the waiting periods between player inputs. These animations varied from subtle movements, like a slight shifting of weight, to more active displays that reflected something of the species' personality. Gengar's animated sprite in the games that included this feature tends to involve a more dynamic expression than the static version, while Snorlax's animation reflects its sleepy, relaxed disposition through minimal movement that emphasizes its characteristic torpor. The locations of certain items within dungeons and on routes follow patterns that experienced players come to recognize. Items hidden in the overworld that are invisible until the player uses the item finder or walks directly over them tend to appear at specific types of locations, often in corners, dead ends, or positions that are just off the main path that a player following the route's intended direction would naturally pass. These locations were chosen by level designers to reward exploration without making the items easily visible from the standard path, which creates a tension between thoroughness and efficiency for players who want to collect everything. The TM and HM system for distributing learnable moves to Pokémon across a playthrough has changed substantially across the series' history. In early generations, TMs were single-use items that were consumed upon being taught to a Pokémon, which created meaningful decisions about which species should receive access to a particular move. The TM for Ice Beam or Thunderbolt could only be used once, which meant giving it to one Pokémon permanently excluded all others from learning it through that method. In the 5th generation, TMs became reusable items that could be taught to any compatible Pokémon any number of times, which removed the scarcity consideration but made move distribution substantially more flexible and less potentially regrettable. HMs are a subset of moves with special overworld utility that allow the player to interact with certain environmental obstacles. Surf allows travel over water. Cut removes small trees blocking paths. Strength moves large boulders. Flash reduces wild encounter rates in certain locations. The requirement that Pokémon know HMs to navigate the overworld created a practical constraint on team building, since players needed to have HM coverage spread across their team to avoid being blocked from reaching certain areas. This constraint was a consistent point of tension throughout the generations where HMs were required, and their eventual replacement with passive overworld traversal abilities that did not require teaching a move was received positively by much of the player community. The post-game content available after the credits roll in each main series entry has expanded substantially across generations. In the first generation, the post-game consisted primarily of content accessible after the champion was defeated, but not specifically designed as a reward for that completion, including the Southern Islands, which were only accessible via a special item obtained through a real-world event. The second generation added an entirely separate region, Kanto, accessible after the Johto champion was defeated, providing an extended post-game that approximately doubled the playable content available in the base game. The Battle Frontier, introduced in the 3rd generation and expanded in the 4th, provided a set of facilities each with their own rule structure and ranking system, creating an extensive optional challenge for players who had completed the main story and wanted a focused, competitive experience without participating in official online or tournament play. The Battle Factory, one component of the Frontier, gave players randomly selected rental Pokémon rather than allowing them to use their own, which emphasized the player's knowledge of move coverage and matchup theory rather than the quality of their specifically trained team. Players who mastered the Battle Factory's rental system often considered it the most intellectually demanding component of the Frontier. National Dex completion, The goal of having seen or caught every Pokémon in the entire game's database has been a persistent but optional objective across the series. In the first generation, Professor Oak rewarded completion of the Pokédex with a certificate acknowledging the achievement, which was displayed in the player's bedroom. This reward has been maintained in various forms across subsequent games, with the nature of the acknowledgement varying, but the basic structure of a special recognition for complete collection remaining consistent. The practical difficulty of completing the national dex, which typically requires trading with other games or attending events to access all available species, means that very few players achieve it, but it continues to represent an aspiration that shapes how the most dedicated collectors approach the game. The sounds that Pokémon make in the animated series, produced by voice actors performing onomatopoeia based on the character's name, create a specific audio identity for each species that is entirely separate from the electronic cries used in the video games. Pikachu says something that sounds like its name, Jigglypuff produces sounds that approximate its name, and Meowth, whose ability to speak human language is a specific exception to the general behavior of Pokémon in the anime, communicates in full sentences rather than name-based vocalizations. The voice acting for Pokémon names is a characteristic feature of the animated series that distinguishes it from Western animated series, where animal characters typically make sounds associated with their real-world counterparts rather than sounds associated with their names. The localization of Pokémon names from Japanese to other languages involves both direct translation and creative adaptation. Some names transfer directly or nearly directly because the pun or reference they contain works in multiple languages. Others require substantial reworking because the original wordplay is language-specific and cannot function in translation without finding an equivalent in the target language. The result is that the names of many species are genuinely different across language versions, with each language version containing puns and references that work in that language, rather than being strictly literal translations of the Japanese original. Certain Pokémon have names that contain references to specific words or concepts that non-native speakers might not immediately recognize. The name Abra contains a reference to the magical incantation Abracadabra, and its evolutions Kadabra and Alakazam continue this theme by incorporating more of the same incantation. The name Jinx has been connected to the word jinx, suggesting an association with bad luck or curses. Electrode's name combines electrode, an electrical component, with the suffix common to ball-shaped things in English, connecting its design as a round electrified creature to its naming convention. The game's internal clock, which runs in real time when the game cartridge contains a battery, affects a variety of time-sensitive events that the developers built into the game's systems. Certain Pokémon appear only during specific times of day, with morning, day, afternoon, and night, each having their own encounter tables in games that used this system. Certain events occur only on specific days of the week, and a small number of events are tied to specific calendar dates. These time-based systems were designed to encourage ongoing engagement with the game rather than a single concentrated playthrough followed by completion. The clock battery that powers real-time events in certain cartridges can deplete over enough years, which means that games relying on real-time systems eventually lose the ability to advance their in-game clock. When the battery dies, the game continues to function normally for all mechanics that do not depend on the clock, but time-sensitive events freeze at whatever state the clock was in when the battery stopped. This creates situations where a Pokémon game cartridge from the second generation might operate with perpetual nighttime, or might have its berry growth system entirely non-functional. The gradual death of batteries in aging cartridges has become a topic of preservation discussion among long-term collectors. The daylight saving time adjustment creates an interesting edge case for games with real-time clocks, since the time shift can briefly alter which in-game time of day is active. A player who plays regularly in the early morning might find that after a daylight saving adjustment, the same time of real-world morning corresponds to a slightly different in-game time period, which could affect which Pokémon are available in certain locations. The developers typically did not build daylight saving adjustments into the clock systems, which meant the discrepancy resolved itself naturally as the seasons progressed and players adapted to the shifted encounter patterns. The effort value system, sometimes abbreviated as EVI, determines how the experience a Pokémon gains in battle translates into specific stat improvements beyond what level up alone provides. Each Pokémon defeated in battle provides effort values in one or two specific stats, and accumulating effort values in a stat increases the final value of that stat when the Pokémon's stats are calculated. The cap on effort values in any single stat and the total cap across all stats means that players must choose which stats to maximize, and these choices create meaningful differences in how two Pokémon of the same species and level might perform. In earlier generations, effort values were accumulated invisibly without any in-game information about how many had been acquired or how the system worked at all. Players who did not read game guides or connect with other players who had this knowledge simply received the stat bonuses passively without understanding their origin. The lack of visibility into the system meant that many players were unaware of it entirely, even though its effects were influencing every Pokémon they raised. Later generations introduced more visible representations of effort value progress, including visual gauges and informational summaries that made the system accessible to players who wanted to engage with it intentionally. The Pokerus virus is a beneficial condition that doubles the effort values a Pokémon accumulates from defeating opponents. It spreads to other Pokémon in the party upon contact, and lasts for a limited time before the Pokémon becomes cured, but retains the doubled gain as a permanent passive. The rarity of Pokerus, which has an extremely low chance of being acquired from any individual wild encounter, made discovering it a significant event for players who understood its value. Sharing it to other Pokémon in the party before the active carrier was cured was a common practice among players who wanted to maximize the benefit across their entire team. The move minimize causes the user to become visually smaller on screen and raises its evasiveness stat by 2 stages. The evasiveness stat modification means that moves targeting the minimize user have a reduced probability of connecting, which creates a defensive strategy based entirely on increasing the opponent's probability of failure. In practice, a Pokémon that has used minimize multiple times becomes very difficult to hit with most moves, since accuracy checks factor in both the attacking move's accuracy and the defending Pokémon's evasiveness stage. Certain moves are designed to hit with perfect accuracy regardless of the target's evasiveness, which provides a counterplay to evasiveness stacking. Swift, for example, deals normal type damage and never misses, which means it bypasses any evasiveness modifications entirely. Aerial Ace operates on the same principle for flying type damage. The existence of these moves reflects the developer's awareness that unlimited evasiveness stacking needed a counterplay option, since a Pokémon that could not be hit at all would create unsolvable situations. In competitive formats, evasiveness-raising moves have often been restricted or banned, since the combination of maximum evasiveness with healing moves creates an opponent that is both difficult to eliminate and continuously recovering. The interaction between these systems, evasiveness and healing, can produce a state where defeating the opponent requires either perfect accuracy moves or an extended confrontation that relies on the random nature of misses eventually clearing enough turns for the healing to be outpaced. Tournament organizers typically view this combination as producing low-quality gameplay that depends more on probability than skill, which is why evasiveness raising moves are commonly prohibited in organized competitive play. The hidden grottos and special spots that appear in certain games provide an alternative to standard wild encounters by presenting pre-generated Pokémon with specific hidden abilities that cannot be obtained through normal encounter methods. Hidden abilities are alternate ability slots that exist for most species but are not available through random wild encounters, and obtaining a species with its hidden ability often requires specifically targeted efforts like these special locations or event distributions. The hidden ability often changes how a species functions competitively, with certain hidden abilities being more useful than the standard options and others being less relevant. Dream World, a feature introduced alongside the 5th generation games, was an online platform where players could put a Pokémon to sleep in the game and then log into a web browser experience to explore an area, collect items, and find Pokémon with hidden abilities to bring back to the main game. The feature connected the video game to an online platform in a way that was unusual for the series at that time, and it required an internet connection and a specific account to access. The Dreamworld service was eventually shut down as support for the associated online infrastructure ended, which meant that certain hidden ability Pokémon that had been exclusively available through that platform became unobtainable for players who had not acquired them before the closure. The various methods for obtaining hidden ability Pokémon across the series' history created a hierarchy of accessibility where some hidden abilities are relatively easy to obtain, while others require specific event participation, special locations, or trading with other players who already have them. This scarcity, whether by design or as a result of distribution decisions, gives certain hidden ability Pokémon a specific kind of value within the community, and the ability to produce offspring with hidden abilities through the breeding system allows a single originally obtained specimen to eventually produce many descendants with the same ability. The number system used for individual values in the 3rd generation and beyond represented a refinement of a system that had existed in slightly different forms in earlier generations. Prior to the 3rd generation, the equivalent of individual values was a set of numbers called determinant values, which had a smaller range and were tightly coupled with other properties, like gender and shininess. When a Pokémon was generated in the 1st or 2nd generation, its shininess and gender and certain stat values were all derived from the same underlying data, which meant that shiny Pokémon had specific stat characteristics by necessity rather than independently from their shininess. The decoupling of shininess from stat properties in the 3rd generation allowed shiny Pokémon to have the same range of individual values as non-shiny Pokémon, which meant that obtaining a shiny Pokémon with competitive individual values became a goal that was difficult, but theoretically achievable. Prior to this change, the specific stat implications of shininess would have made a competitive shiny Pokémon rare for reasons beyond just its color. The 3rd generation's decoupled systems opened the door to the practice of breeding or encountering Pokémon specifically to find shiny specimens with desirable stat configurations, a practice that became extremely common in competitive communities in subsequent generations. The Masuda method, named after the game director who discussed it in an interview, increases the probability of hatching a shiny Pokémon from an egg when the 2 parent Pokémon being bred come from games with different language settings. A Japanese Ditto bred with an English Pokémon, for example, has a higher chance of producing shiny offspring than 2 Pokémon from the same language of game. The mechanism behind this bonus is an additional check in the shiny calculation that triggers when the parent Pokémon's game of origin language codes differ, which was a quality of life addition that rewarded players who traded internationally. The games often include small acknowledgments of how the world has changed between entries, creating a sense that time has passed within the fiction, even though each game presents itself as a fresh adventure. The second generation games, set 3 years after the events of the first generation, include a brief encounter with a character who has grown older since the earlier game and whose circumstances have changed in ways that reflect those elapsed years. This kind of continuity was unusual for video games at the time and helped establish the sense that the Pokémon world was a persistent place with ongoing history rather than a static backdrop that reset between each entry. The remakes that revisit earlier generations update the graphical presentation and sometimes the game mechanics to match contemporary standards while preserving the core content of the original experience. Players who played the original versions and later played the remakes still had the experience of navigating a familiar world through a different aesthetic lens, with routes and towns they remembered appearing in updated form. The decisions about what to preserve and what to update in these remakes reflect ongoing conversations about how to balance nostalgia with accessibility, since changes that improve the experience for new players can sometimes alter what returning players remember most fondly. Certain details in the post-game of specific entries reference events or characters from across the broader series continuity, rewarding players who have engaged with multiple games and creating connections that are invisible to players who have only experienced a single entry. These continuity threads are generally optional content rather than elements of the main story, which means players who do not seek them out are not missing core narrative information, but are missing supplementary context that enriches the larger world. The ability system, introduced in the third generation, gave each Pokémon access to one of a small number of passive effects that function automatically during battle without requiring any turn to activate. Before abilities existed, the only passive differences between Pokémon of the same species were their individual values and the moves they knew. Abilities changed this by providing constant effects that modified how the Pokémon interacted with weather, status conditions, stat stages, or specific move types. Serene Grace doubles the probability of a move's secondary effect triggering, which transforms moves with modest secondary effect rates into highly reliable tools. A move that normally has a 30% chance of causing flinch or a 20% chance of lowering a stat becomes notably more likely to trigger those effects when used by a Pokémon with Serene Grace. Levitate gives the user immunity to ground-type moves, which is a significant benefit, since ground is one of the most used offensive types in competitive play and carries no resistance from any existing type combination. A Pokémon that would ordinarily receive ground-type damage from moves like Earthquake takes no damage at all while Levitate is active, which frees the Pokémon from needing ground-type coverage when calculating its vulnerabilities. The removal of ground as a concern changes how opponents must approach a Levitate user, since Earthquake, one of the most reliable physical moves in the game, simply stops being an option. Intimidate lowers the physical attack stat of opposing Pokémon by 1 stage when the ability holder enters battle. This immediate effect on the opponent's offensive capability made Intimidate one of the most consistently useful abilities for defensive team building, since reducing incoming physical damage from the moment a Pokémon appears changes the math of every subsequent physical attack during that encounter. Pokémon with Intimidate became regular presences on teams designed to control the pace of battles, since the immediate stat reduction provided a built-in advantage each time the Pokémon was switched in. The Pokémon Ranger spin-off series uses a different interaction model from the main series, requiring players to draw circles around Pokémon on a touchscreen to capture them rather than weakening them in turn-based combat. This capture method emphasizes hand-eye coordination and quick decision-making rather than the strategic patience of the main series, which gave the spin-off a distinct identity while maintaining the central relationship between player and Pokémon. Pokémon captured through the Ranger system were temporary assists rather than permanent companions, which meant the emotional attachment dynamics were structured differently from the long-term relationships the main series cultivated. Pokémon Conquest, a collaboration between Game Freak and Koei Tecmo, translated the main series' creature collection and relationship mechanics into a tactics game structure set in a feudal Japan-inspired world. Each warlord character in the game was linked to a specific Pokémon species through a connection that reflected both the character's personality and various historical and thematic associations. The game required players to build armies of warlords and their Pokémon partners to conquer a series of kingdoms, translating the turn-based single combat of the main series into a grid-based strategic framework with multiple units operating simultaneously. The Pokémon trading card game video game for the original Game Boy reproduced the mechanics of the physical card game within a video game format, providing an opponent-rich environment for players who did not have regular access to other players for physical card games. The game included AI opponents, representing various card clubs, a storyline involving legendary cards, and a full implementation of the first-generation card game's rules and card library. Players who could not participate in local card game communities found the game an accessible introduction to card game mechanics, and it served as a companion to the physical product that extended its reach to players who might not otherwise have encountered it. The pattern of how the series numbers its generations follows a structure where each numbered generation represents a group of games released within a specific period that share a common game engine, regional setting, and batch of new Pokémon. The generation number does not correspond to the chronological age of the franchise divided by some fixed period, but rather to the production cycles that the development team went through. Remakes of earlier generation games are typically released during the era of a later generation, but are not themselves a new generation, since they revisit rather than expand the Pokédex. The games within each generation are often released in pairs with slightly different names and minimal differences in content, a structure designed to encourage trading between players who own different versions. The most significant difference between paired versions is typically the availability of certain Pokémon exclusive to each version, which means that players who want access to all species in their playthrough need to either trade with someone who owns the opposite version or obtain the exclusive Pokémon through other means. This version exclusivity structure has been maintained throughout the series as a mechanism for promoting social interaction between players. Third versions, which were released for most early generations, expanded the content of the paired games with additional story elements, a new or extended postgame, and various quality of life improvements. These third versions typically introduced a cover legendary and framing device that added context to the events of the original paired games. The practice of releasing a third version eventually gave way to releasing pairs of enhanced remakes or sequel games, and the most recent main series entries have moved away from the model entirely in favor of a single paired release with post-launch updates. The way text speed is selected in the game's options menu reflects a small but practical acknowledgement that players read at different speeds and that the default text speed is a compromise between readability and pacing. Players who have played the game multiple times and are familiar with the dialogue often increase the text speed to fast, which makes the games feel more responsive during segments they have already experienced. Players encountering the games for the first time typically benefit from the default speed, which allows enough time to read each line as it appears without requiring them to press buttons to advance text manually. The battle text that appears when moves are used, when damage is dealt, and when effects occur follows a structure that has remained fairly consistent across generations despite changes to other aspects of the game's presentation. The format of describing what happened, with the move name and the result clearly stated, was established in the first generation and provides a play-by-play clarity that allows players to follow exactly what occurred on each turn, even in complex situations involving multiple effects. This communicative clarity was more important in the first generation when players might not have had access to reference materials explaining every mechanic, and it has been maintained even as players have become more generally familiar with how the systems work. The font used in the Pokémon games has changed across generations, with the earlier games using fonts designed for the resolution and display characteristics of their respective hardware, and later games moving to fonts appropriate for higher resolution screens. The original Game Boy used a limited character set in a font that accommodated the constraints of the display, and players who grew up with those games often have a strong association between that font's appearance and the feeling of playing those specific titles. The fonts used in later games tend to feel less immediately distinctive to players who experienced the series primarily through those entries, since font consistency is most noticeable as a change from something familiar. The gym leader battles within each region are designed to test the player's ability to address a specific type matchup challenge with the resources available at that point in the game. An early gym leader who specializes in rock types is positioned at a point in the game where most players would have access to water or grass types capable of dealing super effective damage, but not necessarily a large team of well-developed options. The difficulty calibration depends on both the gym leader's team composition and the available options in the region preceding the gym, which requires the level designers to have a coherent picture of what a player's team might look like upon arriving. Some gym leaders are positioned with type specialties that are particularly difficult to counter with the Pokémon available nearby, which creates a spike in difficulty that some players navigate smoothly while others encounter significant resistance. These spikes are often discussed by players as the places in the game where they were unexpectedly stopped and had to reconsider their approach. The existence of these moments, where the game pushes back against assumptions about which strategies will always work, is part of what gives the gyms their function as genuine checkpoints rather than simply obligatory milestones. Badge mechanics, where collecting a certain number of badges allows the player to use specific HHM moves outside of battle or causes Pokémon up to a certain level to obey the player's commands if they were received in a trade, create a structure that ties the player's explored progress to the functional capabilities available to them. A Pokémon received through a trade that exceeds the level cap of the current badge will not consistently follow commands, which prevents players from short-circuiting the early game by obtaining an extremely high-level Pokémon before they have demonstrated sufficient progress. This mechanic was designed to address a potential imbalance while also providing a narrative justification for why a strong Pokémon might not immediately cooperate with an inexperienced trainer. The visual style of the world maps in Pokémon games has changed substantially across generations, from the tile-based overhead views of the early games to the fully three-dimensional world representations of later entries. The earlier overhead perspective meant that every element of the world was presented on a common visual plane, which gave the games a consistent readability where the player's position, available paths, and points of interest were all visible simultaneously within the camera's frame. Moving to three-dimensional perspectives introduced the possibility of depth and visual variation, but also the challenge of ensuring that navigable areas remained clear and legible despite the more complex presentation. The scale of the world presented to players has never been consistent with what the in-game lore implies. Towns that are described as large cities appear in gameplay as clusters of a few buildings, and routes that narratively represent significant journeys often take only a few minutes to traverse. This compression was a technical and practical necessity in earlier games, and it became a convention that later games maintained even when hardware capabilities would have allowed larger environments. The implied versus presented scale of the Pokémon world is something players largely accept intuitively, operating with the understanding that the gameplay space represents something larger than it literally appears, without requiring that discrepancy to be resolved. The Safari Zone specifically maintained this compressed scale, while also introducing time and resource constraints that made the compression more noticeable, since players were aware of counting steps and therefore more conscious of how quickly they could cross the entire area. The step count in the Safari Zone was chosen to create a sense of scarcity without making the experience unplayably short, which required the level designers to calibrate the density of desirable encounters against the available steps in a way that felt appropriately challenging without feeling arbitrary. The Pokémon anime's handling of certain Pokémon types and powers has occasionally diverged from how those types and powers function in the games, prioritizing narrative effect over mechanical consistency. The anime version of psychic powers is far more dramatic and visually impactful than the game mechanic, with psychic type attacks shown as large telekinetic forces that can throw vehicles or reshape environments. The game mechanic of a psychic type move, dealing special damage based on calculated stats, cannot directly convey that visual spectacle, which means the anime necessarily operates with a different grammar of power than the game. The episodic format of the animated series allows for explorations of individual Pokémon species in greater depth than the games can provide within their structure. An episode centered on a specific species can explore that species' behavior, social dynamics, relationship with humans, and individual personality in ways that the Pokédex's brief entries cannot. These expanded portrayals have given many species a narrative depth in the audience's collective imagination that goes beyond what the games established, and players who watch the anime extensively before or alongside playing the games often have strong associations between specific species in the episodes that featured them prominently. The voice direction for the anime version of villainous team characters has historically emphasized a kind of theatrical menace that contrasts with the relatively flat presentation of those characters in the games, where their personalities are conveyed through limited text interactions and static sprite expressions. The anime's Jesse and James, for example, became beloved characters with recognizable personalities and comedic dynamics that the game's Team Rocket grunts do not possess. This gap between the depth of character available in animation versus the depth available in game dialogue was addressed in later game generations as more cinematic presentation styles became technically feasible. The weather in the overworld of certain Pokémon games changes based on the current in-game time or the game's internal events, creating visual variation that is separate from the battle weather mechanics. Rain visible in the overworld of certain routes in later games does not necessarily correspond to any battle weather being active in encounters in those areas, since overworlds and battle weather are tracked by separate systems. This visual weather was a later addition designed to make the world feel more dynamic and alive, and it reflects the same design impulse that introduced day and night cycles in the second generation. Seasons, introduced in the fifth generation as a four-state cycle that progressed with each in-game month, affected both the visual appearance of areas and the Pokémon available in certain locations. Some areas were inaccessible in certain seasons due to blocked paths or changed terrain, while others had season-exclusive encounter tables that made specific Pokémon available only during a particular time of year. Sawsbuck and its pre-evolution deerling changed their appearance based on the current season, which is the most visually prominent implementation of the seasonal mechanic in terms of its effect on a specific species' presentation. The seasonal system was not continued in subsequent generations, which means that the Pokémon introduced in the 5th generation with season-specific forms or behaviors are presented differently when they appear in later games that do not have a seasonal cycle. This inconsistency in how those species are handled across the series is one of several cases where a mechanic introduced in one generation was not carried forward, requiring some accommodation for the species whose design was intertwined with that mechanic. The communication between different generation games through the trading and transferring systems has required ongoing adaptation as hardware and software have changed. Early generation games could trade with their contemporary counterparts through the link cable, but could not directly transfer Pokémon to later generation games in a usable form. The Pokémon Coliseum and XD games for the GameCube provided a transitional steps for moving Pokémon from later 2nd generation games into the 3rd generation format, which required a specific process of migration that retained the Pokémon's fundamental data while translating it into the new game's internal format. The PAL Park feature in the 4th generation games allowed migration of Pokémon from 3rd generation games with a specific process that retired the Pokémon from the source game and recreated it in the destination game. Migrated Pokémon could not be traded back to their source games, which made migration a one-way journey for any given Pokémon. This irreversibility was a practical consequence of the differences between the 2 generations' internal data formats, since a Pokémon translated from one format to another contains data that the original format could not fully represent. The Pokémon Bank and later Pokémon Home services represent an attempt to create a persistent, cloud-based storage that can hold Pokémon across multiple game generations without requiring the physical transfer hardware of earlier solutions. The ability to move Pokémon between games, separated by years and hardware generations within this cloud storage system, has made it possible for players to maintain collections that span the entire modern era of the series, carrying Pokémon forward from games that are no longer commercially supported into current releases. The longevity of these collections is contingent on the continued operation of the cloud service, which creates a dependency that older physical transfer methods did not have. The Pokémon World Tournament in the 5th generation's sequels assembled gym leaders and champions from all previously released regions in a single facility where players could battle them in various format categories. This gathering of previously established characters from multiple games provided an opportunity for players who had not played earlier entries to encounter those characters, and for players who had played those earlier entries to revisit them in a new context with updated teams reflecting the current generation's meta. The tournament's format included categories based on generation, of origin, type specialization, and mixed brackets, providing structural variety alongside the character-based appeal. The Battle Maison and Battle Tree in subsequent generations followed a similar model of providing a post-game challenge facility with increasingly difficult opponents as the player advanced through its bracket system. Each facility had its own structure of rewards for reaching specific milestones, which provided goals for players who had exhausted the main story content and wanted a directed challenge. The personnel in these facilities often included familiar characters from the local game's story or from previous entries, continuing the pattern of the World Tournament's character integration while scaling it to the specific world of each game. The Endgame facilities that have appeared across the series reflect a consistent recognition by the developers that a subset of players will engage with the game far beyond the conclusion of the main story. These players seek not just completion, but mastery, and providing directed challenges with escalating difficulty and meaningful rewards gives that engagement structure and purpose. The specific design of each facility varies, but the underlying intention to give dedicated players a place to continue after the narrative is resolved has been maintained as a consistent feature across the series' history. The sound of footsteps changes. Depending on the surface, a player character is walking on in games that implemented this level of audio detail. Grass produces a soft rustle, water produces a splashing sound, sand produces a muffled thud, and wooden floors produce a distinct creak. These audio details are part of the broader effort to make the world feel materially real rather than visually abstracted, and they operate at a level of subtlety that players often absorb without consciously registering. The sound design in Pokémon games has generally been handled with this kind of layered attention, with ambient sounds, surface-specific footsteps, and environmental audio all contributing to a sense of place that complements the visual presentation. The music that plays in each town and route is designed to establish the emotional tone of that location and to be sustained listening over extended periods, since players might spend considerable time in any given area. The melodies for routes tend to be more dynamic and rhythmically active than those for towns, which creates a sense of movement and progress during travel that transitions to a more settled feeling when a town is reached. This musical distinction between traveling and arriving mirrors the actual experience of the journey and creates a pleasant audio rhythm to exploration that encourages players to keep moving. The boss battle music in Pokémon games applied to gym leaders, the Elite Four, champions, and legendary encounters follows conventions that signal the significance of the encounter through increased tempo, more complex instrumentation in later generations, and melodic urgency. Players who have experienced many of these encounters develop an immediate recognition response to the musical category, which amplifies the sense of anticipation when a high-stakes encounter begins. The ability of music to cue anticipation without any accompanying visual cue is particularly useful in games where the encounter type is already known to the player from contextual information, since the music can reinforce and amplify an existing emotional state. The Pokémon series has included references to real-world, ecological, and biological concepts in ways that reward players who notice them. The fossil Pokémon of the first generation were explicitly modeled after real prehistoric creatures, with Kabuto and Kabutops bearing resemblance to horseshoe crabs, and Omanite and Omastar resembling ammonites. These design choices invited players to make connections between the game's fictional creatures and the real-world fossils they might encounter in museums or science education, which gave those species a particular kind of grounding in reality that most other Pokémon do not share. The mimicry behavior described in certain Pokédex entries reflects actual biological strategies used by real organisms, even though the specific implementations in the Pokémon world are fantastical. Mimikyu's desire to disguise itself as Pikachu to be liked and avoid frightening encounters parallels the behavior of real mimicking animals that take on the appearance of more familiar or less threatening species. The biological accuracy of the underlying strategy, combined with the emotionally resonant interpretation applied to a specific fictional creature, creates the distinctive quality that many Pokédex entries have of feeling simultaneously true and invented. The type-based classification system in Pokémon maps loosely onto taxonomic thinking, where the type serves as a broad categorization that groups species by shared characteristics, regardless of their otherwise divergent designs. The bug type includes both caterpillar stage Pokémon and fully developed insect Pokémon of many different body plans, and the water type includes fish, crustacean, mammal, and reptile designs that share only their aquatic habitat. This loose type taxonomy creates a familiar logical framework for organizing a very diverse collection of species while leaving room for the enormous variety that defines the series' visual identity. The move Trick Room reverses the speed order for all Pokémon in battle for 5 turns, causing the slowest Pokémon to act first rather than the fastest. This reversal creates an entirely different strategic context from normal battle order, since Pokémon with very low speed stats that would ordinarily be the last to act become the first. A team built for Trick Room deliberately uses slow, powerful Pokémon that benefit enormously from acting before the opposition, and the 5-turn duration creates an urgency for both the Trick Room user and the opponent, since the opponent wants to end the room's effect before being eliminated, while the Trick Room user wants to maximize the damage dealt during those turns. Gravity is a move that grounds all airborne Pokémon, eliminating the immunity to ground-type moves provided by levitation or flying type, reduces the evasiveness of all Pokémon, and prevents moves that require flying like Fly or Bounce from being used. The combined effects of gravity create a different set of strategic implications from any single move, providing a type immunity negation or evasiveness reduction would, since the simultaneous application of multiple effects creates synergies that players can exploit in combination with their team's specific move coverage. Tailwind is a move that doubles the speed of all Pokémon on the user's side of the field for a limited number of turns. Unlike the Choice Scarf item, which multiplies the individual holder's speed permanently as long as it is held but restricts move choice, Tailwind affects the whole team simultaneously, but expires after a fixed number of turns. In double battles, where 2 Pokémon per side are active at once, Tailwind's benefit extends to both active Pokémon, which makes it significantly more valuable than in single battles where only 1 Pokémon benefits from the speed boost at a time. The number system used for trainer identification assigns each trainer character encountered during gameplay a unique ID number, which is distinct from the Pokémon ID system used to track ownership and lottery eligibility. NPC trainers are assigned IDs that never interfere with the player's own ID or with the Pokémon tracking systems, since they exist as characters rather than as entities with ongoing relationships to the stored Pokémon data. The internal distinction between the player's systems and NPC systems maintains the clean separation between the player's ongoing data and the disposable data associated with any particular encounter. Trainer classes, the categories like Youngster, Bug Catcher, Swimmer, and Hiker, determine both the visual appearance of trainers and the rough composition and power level of their teams. A youngster in the early areas of a game will have weak Pokémon at low levels, while the same trainer class encountered in a post-game area might have significantly stronger teams if the game accounts for post-game scaling. The trainer class also influences the dialogue the trainer uses when initiating battle and when defeated, with each class having characteristic speech patterns that reflect the personality archetype associated with that visual type. The recurring trainer characters, who appear multiple times across a single game and level up their teams between encounters, represented a more sophisticated implementation of trainer design than the single encounter trainers that fill routes. These recurring characters, which include rivals and certain story-relevant individuals, have team compositions that reflect the time elapsed in the narrative, with their Pokémon growing stronger in ways that parallel the player's own progression. The design of these characters requires projecting the player's likely team strength at multiple points across the entire game and calibrating the rival's team accordingly. The game's handling of time-based encounters is complicated by the fact that different species become available at different times of day through encounter tables that change based on whether the internal clock reads morning, day, or night. The morning period, which in the second generation covered the hours from 4 to 10, gave access to species that were unavailable during the afternoon and night periods in certain locations. Players who played exclusively in the evening might complete large sections of the game without ever encountering certain species unless they specifically adjusted their play schedule or allowed the game to run through a full day cycle. The Pokémon Snap sequel, released in more recent years, for the Nintendo Switch maintained the core photography premise of the original while significantly expanding the number of Pokémon available, the variety of environmental contexts, and the complexity of the interactions that players could trigger by using different items and actions within each stage. The sequel's environments included areas at different times of day and different weather conditions within a single playthrough, which allowed for a greater variety of Pokémon behaviors and compositions to photograph than the original's fixed conditions permitted. The Pokémon Go mobile game translated the concept of finding Pokémon in the real world into an augmented reality format using GPS location data and a phone camera. The encounter mechanic requires players to physically travel to different real-world locations to find different species, which created a social and physical dimension to Pokémon collection that the main series games on portable systems had implied through their trading mechanics, but never made the actual capture experience dependent upon. Raids, which require multiple players to gather at a specific real-world location simultaneously to battle a powerful Pokémon together, applied the social dimension of the main series link cable functionality to a massively multiplayer context. The design of the Pokémon world's healing infrastructure reflects a particular vision of how a society that keeps powerful creatures might function. Pokémon centers exist in every town and are free to use, which establishes that access to Pokémon healing is treated as a public service rather than a commercial transaction in this world. The consistency of this detail across every region of every game creates a stable assumption about the Pokémon world's social structure that players absorb without ever being explicitly told it as lore. Pokémarts, the shops that sell items including Pokéballs, healing items, and status cures, exist alongside the centers as commercial establishments, which establishes that while basic healing is public, supplementary items and resources must be purchased. The economy implied by this combination, free healing paired with commercial item acquisition, reflects a specific set of values about what should be accessible to all trainers versus what requires investment. Players who start a new game with limited funds and gradually accumulate wealth through battle winnings experience the progression from resource scarcity to resource abundance as a direct consequence of this underlying economic structure. The way Pokémon are healed to full health instantly by Pokémon centers, rather than through a gradual healing process or a healing period, reflects a design choice that prioritizes flow and player convenience over realistic simulation. A healing process that took real time would interrupt the pace of exploration and battle in a way that would quickly become frustrating, while the instant heal allows players to engage with the next challenge immediately after preparing for it. This prioritization of player convenience over simulation fidelity is consistent throughout the series and reflects the fundamental design philosophy that the game's systems exist to support the player's enjoyment rather than to model a realistic world. The Pokémon world's geography, spread across islands and continents, connected by water routes and mountain passes, creates a sense of spatial coherence that rewards players who pay attention to how regions relate to each other. The Pokémon world map, as it has been assembled from individual regional maps across the series, places certain regions in rough geographic proximity based on their cultural and faunal similarities. Kanto and Johto are adjacent and share some species, which reflects both the shared development history of those regions' games and the in-world logic of bordering territories having related ecosystems. The oceans between regions in the Pokémon world are navigable through the game's mechanics, and certain games allow players to access an additional region via ship or other water transport after completing the primary region's story. The SS An in Kanto and various ferries and sea routes in other games provide both narrative transitions between locations and practical gameplay contexts for encounters and item collection. The use of sea travel as a significant in-game activity reflects the geographic reality of a world made up largely of islands and coastal landmasses, where water navigation would naturally be an essential form of transportation. The sky, which in the games is accessible through moves like fly and later through species that allow the player to ride them through the air, represents an additional navigational layer that sits above the ground level of routes and towns. The sky level encounter tables that appear in games where this layer is developed contain species associated with aerial environments, reflecting the ecological logic of where flying creatures would naturally be found. The stratification of encounter tables by height with different species at ground level, in water, and in the air creates a sense of vertical depth to the world's ecology that complements the horizontal diversity of different route environments. The relationship between version mascots and the narratives of their respective games has become progressively more integrated across generations. In the first generation, the mascot legendary Mewtwo is not the mascot in any promotional sense and is encountered as a powerful optional catch at the end of an optional area rather than through the main story. By the third generation, the cover legendaries Groudon and Kyogre are central to the main story's conflict, and their opposed powers over land expansion and ocean expansion provide the thematic framework for the story's climax. The concept of legendary Pokémon as narrative devices has meant that their designs carry thematic weight that non-legendary species typically do not. Xerneas and Yveltal, the cover legendaries of the 6th generation, embody the opposition of life and death, which is directly relevant to the game's story about an energy weapon that threatens extinction. Zygarde, the third legendary of that generation, represents a balance or equilibrium between these opposing forces, completing a thematic trio that maps onto the game's narrative concerns. The design of legendary trios with opposing and balancing members has become a recurring structural element of the series. The signature moves associated with specific legendary Pokémon, moves that in most cases only those Pokémon can learn, reflect the same thematic thinking applied to their designs. Groudon's signature move is thematically connected to its dominion over land, Kyogre's to its dominion over water, and Rayquaza's to the sky it inhabits. These thematic connections create internal consistency between a legendary's design, its narrative role, and its mechanical identity, which gives the legendary Pokémon a holistic coherence that most other species achieve only through implied rather than stated design intent. The way the Pokémon games handle the player's progression through an area ensures that new content is revealed at a pace calibrated to match the player's expanding capabilities. Routes are designed with certain traversal obstacles, a body of water, a dark cave, a patch of grass requiring a specific HM that prevent the player from fully exploring them on first encounter and require them to return later with the necessary resources. This gating structure ensures that each return to a previously visited area has a specific purpose and reveals new content, which makes backtracking feel productive rather than repetitive. The optional caves and hidden paths that exist throughout each region reward players who explore thoroughly rather than following only the critical path. These optional areas often contain higher-level wild Pokémon, rare items, or encounters with notable trainers whose teams provide meaningful experience for the player's party. Some optional areas have been specifically designed to test whether a player's team is prepared for the challenges ahead, functioning as informal difficulty gauges that prepared players can clear efficiently, while underprepared players encounter significant resistance. The relationship between exploration and progression in the Pokémon games operates through a structure that is technically nonlinear within each route section, but highly linear in terms of the order in which regions become accessible. Players can choose how thoroughly to explore each available area before advancing to the next required destination, but the next required destination itself is accessible only after the current section's story beat is resolved. This semi-linear structure gives the games a sense of openness while maintaining the narrative coherence needed for the player's journey to feel like a story rather than a collection of disconnected episodes. The Pokémon games have included cameos and references to real-world geography that players familiar with those places might recognize. The Johto region is broadly modeled after the Kansai region of Japan, encompassing cities like Osaka and Kyoto, while Kanto shares its name with an actual region of Japan that includes Tokyo. These geographic inspirations influenced the visual design of towns and routes, with certain architectural styles, landscape features, and cultural details reflecting their real-world counterparts in abstracted form. The name Kanto itself was one of the first things that players familiar with Japanese geography noticed as a point of direct correspondence between the game world and the real one. The food items present in the Pokémon world and referenced in Pokédex entries exist in a curious relationship with the presence of Pokémon as the dominant form of wildlife. The games never explicitly address what food is made from in a world where most of the wildlife is composed of Pokémon, leaving players to infer that either Pokémon-derived food exists or that some form of conventional agriculture and animal husbandry persists alongside Pokémon. This ambiguity is maintained carefully across all entries in the series, with food items appearing as healing commodities without their origin being specified in any way that would force the question. The berries that players find and grow serve as both healing items and cooking ingredients across various games and spin-offs. Poffins in the 4th generation were made by cooking berries in a mini-game format that determined the resulting Poffin's flavor and strength, connecting the practical mechanics of berry use to a small craft activity. The flavors associated with different berries and the preferences different Pokémon have for specific flavors created a system that rewarded players who tracked their team's flavor preferences and cooked accordingly, adding a layer of personalization to the activity of raising Pokémon for contests. The various accessories and decorating systems present in some Pokémon games allow players to customize their trainer character's appearance and their game's base of operations. The secret base system in the 3rd generation allowed players to create a private space in certain locations on the map and decorate it with furniture and items obtained during their adventure. These bases could be visited by other players through link cable or wireless connection, and defeating the base owner in battle allowed visitors to temporarily use the base's features. The secret base system was expanded in the remake of the 3rd generation games, giving it additional functionality and a more prominent role in the social features available to players. The Pokémon Amy and later Pokémon Amy replacement features, introduced in the 6th generation, allowed players to directly interact with their Pokémon through touchscreen mechanics, feeding them treats, petting them, and playing minigames with them. These interactions raised a friendship-adjacent stat that provided certain battle benefits, including a small chance of surviving attacks that would otherwise eliminate the Pokémon, a small chance of landing critical hits more frequently, and a higher rate of experience gain. The feature was designed to deepen the sense of personal relationship between player and Pokémon by providing a direct physical interaction that the battle and exploration systems did not offer. The clothing and character customization options that became available in the 6th generation allowed players to select outfits, hairstyles, and accessories for their trainer character, expanding the identity expression available beyond the limited options of previous games. Earlier games had offered some name selection and limited appearance choices at the beginning of the game, but 6th generation introduced an ongoing clothing system where items could be purchased and mixed in boutique shops across the region. This expansion of customization options reflected a broader trend in the series toward giving players more tools for personal expression within the game world. The competitive scene around Pokémon has produced a significant body of documented knowledge about move interactions, damage calculations, speed tiers, and team composition theory. This knowledge exists in various forms across community wikis, forum archives, and databases maintained by players who have tested game mechanics empirically by running the relevant scenarios in-game and recording the results. The process of building this knowledge base has been ongoing throughout the series' history, with each new generation introducing new mechanics that require new testing and new theory development. The concept of speed tiers refers to the groupings of base speed stats that determine which Pokémon can outspeed which others under various conditions. A Pokémon with a base speed of 105 can outspeed any Pokémon with a base speed of 104 or lower under equivalent conditions, which makes the specific value of a Pokémon's base speed relevant to its competitive viability. The addition of speed modifiers from items, abilities, and moves creates a more complex picture where the base tier is only one factor in the actual speed comparison on any given turn. Damage calculation in competitive contexts often requires knowing whether a specific attack deals enough damage to eliminate an opponent in 1 or 2 hits under various conditions. This knowledge, often expressed in terms like it's a guaranteed 1-hit elimination or it's a 2-hit elimination after a previous attack, is essential for making decisions about which move to use on a given turn. Players who have internalized these damage benchmarks make decisions quickly and confidently, while players who are less familiar with the specific numbers are making partially informed guesses that may or may not prove accurate. The Pokémon Company's management of the franchise involves coordination between multiple departments and partner organizations, since the franchise spans games, animation, trading cards, merchandise, and various licensed products. The consistency of the visual design across these different products, where a Pikachu in the animated series, and a Pikachu in the games, and a Pikachu on a trading card, and a Pikachu on a piece of merchandise, are all immediately recognizable as the same character, reflects the maintenance of a consistent design standard across all licensed uses. The official Pokédex entries, which appear in the games and describe each species with brief, often poetic descriptions of their behavior and biology, are written with an intentional tone that creates the impression of a field guide compiled by researchers in the Pokémon world. The entries frequently describe behaviors that would be terrifying if taken literally, with species described as consuming the life force of sleeping humans, absorbing souls, or leaving environments devastated. This juxtaposition of the mundane game context of raising and battling with the horrifying content of Pokédex descriptions creates a specific dissonance that players have noted for decades as one of the more peculiar characteristics of the series. The structure of the Pokédex as a device that records information on Pokémon as they are encountered or caught reflects a scientific record-keeping framing that gives the player character the role of a fieldwork contributor. The entries are presented as objective descriptions, but their content reflects a particular cultural fascination with cataloging and systematizing the natural world that connects to the collecting impulse the games otherwise encourage. Completing the Pokédex is not just an achievement within the game's system, but a fulfillment of the scientific framing established at the beginning of the adventure. The Pokémon games have historically included mechanics that operate on scales far beyond what casual play reveals, rewarding deep engagement with systems that most players never encounter in meaningful depth. The chain fishing mechanic, introduced in the 6th generation, increased the probability of encountering shiny Pokémon when fishing in the same spot consecutively without interrupting the chain. Each successful catch extended the chain, and the shiny probability improved progressively until reaching a considerably higher rate than the base encounter probability. Breaking the chain, whether by moving, encountering a non-fishing encounter, or failing to hook a Pokémon quickly enough, reset the probability to its base value, which meant that chain fishing required sustained, careful attention over an extended period. The Poke Radar, which appears in certain games, uses a similar chain extending mechanic where consecutive encounters with the same species in specifically shaking grass patches increases the shiny probability for that species. Using the radar causes patches of grass to shake, and selecting the correct patch, one that shakes in a particular way, indicating a same species encounter, extends the chain, while choosing incorrectly or encountering a different species breaks it. The visual feedback required to correctly identify which shaking pattern indicated a chain extending patch made radar chaining an activity that demanded concentration and pattern recognition over the course of potentially very long chain sequences. Soaring through the sky in the third generation, Remake allowed players to observe the world from above and reach certain cloud-covered locations that were inaccessible from the ground, including areas where specific Pokémon could be encountered that were not available through any other method in those games. The aerial navigation layer gave a different perspective on the region's geography, allowing players to see how the areas they had traversed on the ground related to each other in the larger spatial context. The mechanics served both a practical purpose, accessing exclusive content, and an aesthetic one, providing a memorable experience of flight that distinguished it from the simple point-to-point transport that the fly move had traditionally provided. The move attract causes the target to become infatuated if it is of the opposite gender from the user, making it unable to execute moves 50% of the time for as long as infatuation persists. The gender-dependent nature of attract creates an asymmetry in its application, since it cannot affect Pokémon of the same gender as the user, genderless Pokémon, or Pokémon with the Oblivious ability, which grants immunity to infatuation. This restricts Attract's reliable utility compared to status conditions that affect all targets equally regardless of gender or ability. The Cute Charm ability triggers an infatuation effect on opponents of the opposite gender who make contact with the ability holder, paralleling Attract's effect but occurring passively through the ability rather than requiring a move slot. The combination of Cute Charm with the mechanic for increasing shiny encounter rates, which involves encountering the same species multiple times in succession with a specific gender and nature combination influencing the probability, was discovered by players to create a method for more reliably encountering shiny Pokémon of specific genders. This discovered interaction between an ability and the shiny probability system represents the kind of unintended mechanical synergy that player communities identify and document through systematic testing. Taunt prevents the target from using status moves for 3 turns, forcing it to use only attacking moves during that period. Against Pokémon that rely primarily on status moves for their effectiveness, Taunt completely removes their primary source of utility for its duration. A stall-oriented Pokémon that uses recovery moves, entry hazard moves, and status condition moves as its primary tools become significantly less effective under Taunt, since it can only use the attacking moves it carries for coverage rather than the non-damaging moves that define its role. The existence of Taunt as a widely available move prevents the simple practice of carrying exclusively status moves from being an unbeatable strategy. The introduction of Mega Evolution in the 6th generation provided a mid-battle transformation for certain Pokémon, changing their appearance, stats, and sometimes their typing for the remainder of the battle. The transformation required a specific held item corresponding to the Pokémon species and a keystone held by the trainer, and only 1 Mega Evolution could be active per trainer per battle. The mechanic dramatically increased the power of the affected species, creating a set of significantly more powerful versions of established Pokémon that saw immediate adoption in competitive play. The visual design of mega evolutions typically emphasized a more dramatic version of the base species, often with larger or more prominent features, different color schemes, and additional visual elements that suggested increased power. Charizard received two distinct megaforms with different typings, which was unusual and reflected the significant cultural weight the species carries within the franchise. Mega Charizard X changes the species to a Fire and Dragon type, while Mega Charizard Y remains Fire and Flying with boosted special attack, giving players distinct strategic options depending on which Megastone they chose. Z moves, introduced in the 7th generation as the mechanic replacing Mega Evolution, allowed a Pokémon to use a massively powered version of a specific move type once per battle using a Z Crystal held item. Unlike Mega Evolution, Z moves were available to any Pokémon that knew a move of the corresponding type, which made the mechanic broadly accessible rather than limited to specific species with Megastones. The visual presentation of Z moves involved a brief animated sequence of the trainer performing a specific physical motion, connecting the trainer and Pokémon in the execution of the move in a way that previous mechanics had not. The move Protect and its various variants create a single turn shield that makes the user invulnerable to most forms of damage for that turn. Using Protect on consecutive turns reduces its probability of success, which prevents it from being used reliably every turn as an indefinite damage avoidance strategy. The probability reduction resets after any turn on which Protect is not used, which means the practical pattern of Protect use in competitive play is alternating protected and unprotected turns, using the protected turn to avoid a predicted attack while using the unprotected turn to deal damage or setup. In double battles, the move Wide Guard protects all Pokémon on the user's side from moves that target multiple Pokémon simultaneously. Since double battles involve Pokémon being active on both sides at once, moves that hit all Pokémon on the field or all opponents simultaneously are particularly powerful, and Wide Guard provides a defensive tool specifically designed to counter this category of move. The strategic decision of when to use Wide Guard, knowing that the opponent might not use a multi-target move on that turn, adds a layer of prediction to double battle play that distinguishes it from the more straightforward calculation of single battles. The move Spikes places an entry hazard on the opponent's side of the field that deals damage to opposing Pokémon when they switch in, unless they are Flying type or Levitating. The damage increases with additional layers of spikes, up to a maximum of 3 layers, with each additional layer increasing the proportion of the switching Pokémon's maximum hit points that are removed on entry. Rapid Spin and Defog are moves that remove entry hazards, creating a strategic dynamic where one team tries to maintain its hazards on the field while the other tries to remove them, and the success of each side's efforts significantly affects the attrition balance of the overall battle. The nature system assigns each Pokémon one of 25 natures at the moment of its generation, with each nature increasing one stat by 10% and decreasing another by 10%, with 5 neutral natures that neither increase nor decrease any stat. The nature's effect is applied after the full stat calculation, which means the 10% modification is applied to the final value, including individual values, effort values, and base stats, making the nature's impact scale with all other stat improvements. A nature that increases the most important stat for a particular Pokémon's role and decreases the least important stat maximizes the benefit while minimizing the cost, which is why specific nature preferences are associated with specific competitive roles. The mint items introduced in later generations allow the nature's effect to be changed after the Pokémon is already caught, which remove the requirement of finding a Pokémon with the desired nature in the wild or through breeding. Before mints were available, obtaining a Pokémon with a competitive nature required either encountering one naturally, which depended on encountering many individuals until one with the correct nature appeared, or using the synchronize ability on the late Pokémon, which increases the probability of wild encounters sharing the lead's nature. Mints made nature adjustment accessible to all players, rather than only those willing to invest significant time in probability management. The characteristic system provides a single piece of information about which individual value is highest for a given Pokémon, expressed through a flavor text that appears on the Pokémon's summary screen. A characteristic like often lost in thought indicates that the special attack individual value is the highest, while takes plenty of siestas indicates that hit points is highest. This information was included as a partial accessibility feature for the otherwise completely hidden individual value system, giving players a small window into their Pokémon's hidden data without requiring external tools or calculations. The music of the Pokémon anime has followed a similar pattern of recurring motifs and themes that provide audio continuity across the different arcs and settings of the long-running series. The main title music, which has been rearranged and re-recorded multiple times across the history of the English dub, maintained melodic elements from its original version in subsequent iterations, creating a thread of musical continuity even as other production elements changed. Regional themes in the anime tend to reflect the cultural and environmental character of the setting, with Alola's music carrying tropical instrumental characteristics and Galar's music incorporating elements of British pop and rock that parallel the region's UK-inspired geography. The movie soundtracks have typically been more orchestrally elaborate than the television series music, with original compositions accompanying the theatrical releases that do not appear in the episodic series. The first movie's music established a template of using orchestral scoring alongside electronic elements to create a sound profile that was grander than the television series, while still being recognizable as belonging to the same franchise. Later movie soundtracks have varied in their approach, depending on the tone and setting of each individual film, with some leaning heavily into orchestral conventions, and others maintaining a closer relationship with the game music that inspired them. The game music composers, particularly Junichi Masuda, and later Go Ichinos and Shota Kageyama, among others, have each contributed distinct compositional voices to the series while working within the conventions established by earlier entries. The game music database maintained by dedicated fans catalogs these contributions, noting which composers worked on which games and which specific tracks, creating a historical record of the musical development of the franchise that parallels the fan documentation of the game's other systems and content. The towns in each Pokémon region carry names that reflect the regional naming convention established for that game's setting. Towns in Kanto have color-based names, those in Johto have names related to plants and natural imagery, and those in Hoenn have names that combine natural and navigational themes. These naming conventions create a regional character that persists across the names of every location the player visits, reinforcing the sense that each region has a unified identity expressed through multiple layers of design, including naming patterns. The gym towns, where gym leaders maintain their facilities, are typically among the more developed towns in each region, featuring more buildings and more trainer activity than the smaller root towns that exist primarily as stopping points between larger destinations. This size disparity reflects the narrative logic that gym towns are important civic centers where competitive Pokémon training is a recognized and supported activity, while smaller towns serve primarily as communities for people living along the routes between these centers. The final towns before each game's endgame area tend to be the most narratively significant locations outside the gym structure, serving as staging points for the game's climax and containing information, characters, or items that prepare the player for what is ahead. The experience of arriving at these final pre-endgame towns carries a particular weight in retrospect, since players often remember them as the places where the game's tone shifted and the sense of approaching something significant became unavoidable. This sense of arrival is created through a combination of music, dialogue, visual design, and the pacing of story revelations that the designers calibrate carefully to produce a specific emotional effect at a specific point in the player's journey. The Pokémon series handles its version of science through a lens that is simultaneously grounded and fantastical. Professor Oak's opening monologue in the first generation, establishing the concept of Pokémon as creatures that live alongside humans in a world very much like ours, except populated by these extraordinary creatures, set the tone for how the series would always approach its own fiction. The world is presented as fundamentally comprehensible, one where researchers study Pokémon using methods analogous to real biology and ecology, and where the extraordinary nature of the creatures is treated as an established fact rather than a wonder requiring ongoing astonishment. The professor characters across generations have each had distinct research interests that reflected the themes of their respective games. Professor Birch's interest in Pokémon habitats connected to Hoenn's exploration-focused themes. Professor Rowan's interest in Pokémon evolution paralleled Sinnoh's themes of mythology and transformation, and Professor Juniper's interest in the origins of Pokémon connected to Unova's questions about the relationship between people and Pokémon. These research specialties give each professor a reason to exist beyond the structural role of providing the starter Pokémon and the Pokédex, embedding them in the larger thematic concerns of their respective games. The Pokémon world's treatment of science as an accessible and admirable pursuit has remained consistent across the series, with player characters often helping researchers, collecting data, and interacting with technological systems as a natural part of their adventure. This framing places the player's journey within a context of organized inquiry about the world, suggesting that the Pokédex project is not merely a personal collecting hobby, but a contribution to a larger body of scientific knowledge about Pokémon that benefits everyone in the world. The game's structure, where completing the Pokédex is a primary goal presented approvingly by the professor, reinforces this framing and gives the collecting activity a purpose beyond personal achievement. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.